If the walls of certain homes could speak, some of the stories they would tell would more than likely shock and amaze us. Or perhaps repulse and terrify us instead. This is one such story that if a house could tell its own tale, it would certainly be one we would never forget. A family moves to the country in search of peace, but those dreams are soon shattered by supernatural terror. Something evil lurks within the woods outside of their home, and this evil begins to stalk and wreak havoc upon everyone that dwells within the home. Can they save themselves before it's too late? This is the untold story of the haunted Hinsdale house, also known as the Dandy House, and the entities that infested it. Hinsdale, New York, a small town with a rustic and rural charm, tucked deep into the countryside and far away from the crime, concrete, and smog of New York City. Instead of gazing at skyscrapers, they would rather gaze at the surrounding mountains, covered in dense foliage. But these mountains and their surrounding woods harbor many secrets and have many stories to tell. This is just one of them. The year is 1970, and the Dandy family is in pursuit of their American dream. After years of vacationing to Hinsdale and the surrounding areas to catch a break from their fast-paced life in Buffalo, they've finally reached a point where they can turn their vacation into their daily life. Seeking their own rural paradise, they come across a listing for a home that seems idyllic for their family and its needs. Clara Dandy, the mother of the family, believed that they all got along so much better in the country, like it had some form of redemption qualities about it that seemed to rejuvenate their spirits and their relationships. As they wind their way through the countryside, they lay eyes on the home for the first time. They are not only taken aback by the beauty and the sheer size of the house, but that it sat upon 8 acres of land, surrounded by dense and breathtaking woods. Clara would describe her feelings about first seeing the house as being overcome with a deep sense of peace. It was like I had finally come home after years of being elsewhere. And the air was like breathing champagne. It was wonderful. The home is over 100 years old and still had most of the original and ornate woodwork intact. It just seemed to emanate charm and elegance. As the children explored the nearby woods, Mr. and Mrs. Dandy continued their tour. But when they were being shown the storage space underneath the stairs, the door was initially stuck. But after some elbow grease from Mr. Dandy, they were finally able to get it open. It revealed a dusty space of sorts with a fireplace, and one that didn't seem to fit the feeling of the house at all. Clara would describe her feelings towards the space like this: I wasn't sure why, but I felt very uneasy when we opened up the storage space. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it was dark and desolate, not at all like the rest of the house. But she quickly would dismiss these feelings, attributing the creepy factor to her city upbringing, and the fact that they didn't have storage rooms like that where she was from. After closing the space and continuing to evaluate their opportunity, the feelings of peace would return, and the Dandies decide that they can't resist the charm of this rustic, 100-year-old home, so they decide to purchase it. Once things are squared away several months later, they move in to start their new, rural existence. On move-in day, Clara's brother decided to lend a helping hand and had begun to move things in hours before the family was able to arrive. When loading in a box of belongings, as he opened the door, he was greeted by a flurry of insects. Both bees and flies pelted him in his face. Brushing past them and then unloading the box onto the floor in the main room, he was startled to see hundreds of dead bees scattered all over the floor, and even more startled to see hundreds still alive and coating the windows. It was still cold during this time of year, and although he too wasn't from the country, he found it rather odd that there would be any kind of infestation at this time. When his sister and her family finally arrive, he greets her with the news, and in order to continue with the move-in, they have to call an exterminator. Upon his arrival, he too confirms the oddity of the situation. He said that he had never seen so many bees and flies in one spot in a home, and given this time of year, it was not normal for them to swarm or infest anything during this time. It takes some time, but after he finishes clearing them out, the family is finally able to get moved in. As time progresses, things seem to fit the dreams they had for moving there in the first place. The family finally seems at peace. They were getting along better and enjoying each other's company, a far departure from their city life in Buffalo. But as the old adage goes, if it seems too good to be true, it is. A few weeks into living in what they believed was going to be their rural paradise, their son Mike has met and made friends with a nearby neighbor. Together, they begin to explore the woods surrounding the Dandy property. As the two navigate the forest, they're startled when they hear the crunching of leaves directly in front of them, stopping frozen in their tracks, and fearing that it could be a bear. They take refuge behind a large tree and sneak glimpses from around its sides to figure out just what it could be. To their shock, they spot a boy not much older than them, carrying a rifle and walking in the path ahead. Yelling at the boy that this is private property and wanting to know what he was doing there, they run towards him and try to catch up to him. They again freeze in their tracks when they notice that not only is the boy transparent the closer they get, but half of his head is missing. As the figure continues to walk and taking deep breaths, they slowly continue to follow him. The three approach a small lake, and within the blink of an eye, the boy vanishes. Mike and his friend are at a loss for words and have no explanation for what they saw. They quickly rush back to the Dandy house as fast as they can to tell anyone who will listen to them. They soon make contact with Clara and explain to her what took place, but she's quick to dismiss their experience as nothing more than overactive imaginations. Another several weeks pass by, and Clara has all but forgotten about what her son had told her. She's now walking the family dog Madison in the woods for some fresh air and exercise. As they get deeper into the forest, Clara starts to hear what can only be described as chanting. As she stops to listen, it sounds eerie and disembodied, as if the sound is all around her, but has no true origin. It's at this time that Madison begins growling and barking. The longer she seems to focus on the chanting, the louder it seems to become. Madison by this point is losing her mind and breaks free from a distracted Clara and bolts in the direction of their home. Clara chases her down, and she finally stops running when she makes it to the front door of their estate. After taking a moment to collect herself, Clara then calls her husband, who, like she was to her son, was quick to dismiss her feelings, thinking that she just had to adjust to rural life and wasn't used to it being so different from their life in the city. Frustrated and worried now about what the chanting could have been, Clara talks with her son about her experience while she prepares dinner for the family. Mike thinks that it could have been some campers at a nearby campground, not too far from where their property line ends, that could have been the cause of the strange sounds. To try and put his mother at ease, he and his friend Matt once again take to the woods to explore this possibility. As they venture further into the woods to a lookout point towards the campsite, they see nothing. There are no signs of any campers that could be nearby enough to have caused such a noise. Even more perplexed now that there was no explanation, the boys start to make their way back to the house, when suddenly they hear what sounds like an axe thudding into a tree right next to them. Unsure of what that noise could have been, before they could even begin to ponder or investigate, they hear a woman screaming to their left. This frightens them so bad that the two young men run as fast as they can all the way back to the dandy's home. When they arrive, Mike is truly scared this time. He has no way of explaining his mother's experience, or any of his own either. Upon relaying this information to Clara, both of them are left beside themselves, now with a chill up both of their spines. But these weird events thus far would only intensify as the sands of time continue to trickle into the hourglass. It has now been months since the initial experiences, and besides the oddities they were, the family's life continues to be great. This distance from the experiences only makes them ever easier to dismiss in the minds of Clara and Mike. One day, Phil, or Mr. Dandy, decides to take the children, Mike and Tina, into Buffalo for the day to get some errands done. Mostly being a homebody, Clara decides to forego the trip with her family and relax at home, reading her latest book instead. When her family departs, Clara finds herself curled up on the couch and immersed in her latest story, as a warm breeze drifts through the open windows of the house. As she reads page to page, she is suddenly startled when the window closest to her slams shut. Upon investigating, it makes no sense to her because the breeze was light, not forceful at all, and their windows were fairly new, which made it all the stranger. But as she always does, she dismisses the happening as nothing more than a weird coincidence and heads back to her book. Several nights later, as Mike lay asleep in his bed, he is suddenly woken up when a nearby box of a chess game drops onto his chest. A storage shelf is directly above his head, so opening his eyes, he glances up to see if perhaps it could have been hanging too far off the edge, causing it to fall. And to his shock, he begins to see several more boxes slowly shifting towards the edge by themselves. The lowest one then suddenly flies out from the rest and smacks him in the chest. Terrified, he sits up trying to catch his breath. He has no way of explaining how the lowest box could be pulled and thrown with such force without bringing the rest of the boxes with it, as if someone or something had grabbed and thrown it by a will of its own. Calling out to his mom in the darkness, she soon arrives in the doorway of his room. Being a very science and logic-minded person, Mike has no way to explain what has happened. Examining the pile, Clara too is perplexed and becomes just as scared when another box from a different pile flies across the room, causing both of them to scream in terror and run out as fast as possible. Trying to make sense of what was taking place, Clara fears that whatever could be lurking in the woods has been stalking her family and has slowly but surely, like a malignant stain, invaded her home. As her fears turn into a revelation, Clara decides to reach out to a local priest for help, hoping her faith will help her come up with some answers, and better yet, some solutions. She speaks with a priest named Father Alphonsus at the University of St. Bonaventure. He believes that the activity could be a poltergeist, but given the intelligent nature of how it seemed to be behaving, Clara has her doubts, but nonetheless wants an expert's opinion and assistance. So arrangements are made for the father to come out and bless the home, and after several days, he arrives. On April 13th, 1975, the cleansing begins. As the family and the priest were all gathered together, and as he began to speak, A series of horrible wailing and moaning noises began to fill the home, as if the house itself was crying. The scent of burning matter also quickly enveloped the house. The activity reached a fever pitch when the priest opened and began to pray over the crawl space that was underneath the stairs. But after this, a blissful silence overtook them all. It was as if whatever entities that dwelled within the walls of the dandy's home had finally been evicted. Within time, the father gathered his things, exchanged pleasantries, and departed for the evening. The family now believed that their darkest days were behind them, and for all intents and purposes, that seemed to be the case. But as if to mock the Holy Trinity itself, 3 months later to the day, all hell would break loose once again. That night, while her husband is away on a business trip, Clara finds herself woken up out of a dead sleep by a series of knocks coming from inside the walls. The knocks themselves are soon accompanied with whispers from someone that she can't see. As she apprehensively makes her way from her room and slowly down the stairs, headed towards the main level, the apparition of a young girl begins to walk by the stairs. She slowly makes her way to the crawl space, opens the door, and closes it behind her. Clara is baffled at the sight. After gathering up her courage, she too makes her way fully down the stairs into the crawl space, and after a moment of bracing herself, she opens the door, only to be met with nothing. Clara then makes her way to her daughter Tina's room to make sure it somehow wasn't her, and perhaps her nerves were just on edge. But after opening her door, she finds her fast asleep in her bed, with no signs that she had been awake for some time. The following morning, while the rest of her family is still asleep, Tina wakes up to begin her day. As she feeds her pet bird in its cage and begins to brush her hair in her oval mirror, she notices that her bird isn't doing its usual whistles. As she glances over at them, she finds it staring into the corner of the room. As Tina glances back up at the mirror, she's met with the apparition of a young girl. Her face is sunk in, and her eyes were gone. She screams in terror, and just as quickly as it appeared, the apparition disappears. The screams of her daughter startles and quickly summons Clara to her daughter's room. As she consoles Tina, she realizes that the priest's blessings were ineffective. She quickly calls Father Al back and explains what had taken place the previous night and that morning. And although he is busy, he promises to come back as soon as possible, and this time to bring a paranormal expert with him as well, to help him determine the cause and hopefully find a working solution. He's able to come back the following week. In the meantime, Clara is determined to keep her family calm. If she can control her own emotions, she knows that everything else will be okay. As they wait for the priest to return, Clara tries her best to keep her family calm and live some sort of a normal existence. That weekend, her and Phil are watching a movie while Mike and Tina are out with friends. As they enjoy their time together, their happiness is quickly shattered by a huge crashing noise coming from outside of their house. Quickly grabbing a flashlight and running outside to investigate together, they quietly step towards where they believed the noise to be originating from, when suddenly they hear it again. But this time, thankfully for them, the origin is not paranormal. This time, it's several raccoons who happen to be foraging through their metal trash cans for something to eat. Relieved for that moment, they start to make their way back to the house, when they suddenly see the figure of a young girl in their living room window, staring at them. As they rush inside, they run up into Tina's room, where they find her incoherent and staring into her oval mirror. They try to get her attention, but she's entirely unresponsive. Her pale blue eyes are black. Panicking, they shake her and yell her name, not knowing what else to do, when she eventually comes back. In that moment and later, Tina will not recall how she got home or what exactly happened. As the family tries to gather themselves from the shock of what had just taken place, they hear movement coming from Mike's room. Phil tells his family not to leave Tina's room as he rushes to investigate. However, the home phone begins to ring. It's Mike. He's asking if he can stay the night at his friend Randy's house. However, when told what was going on, he quickly tells her that he's coming home to help in any way that he can. Rushing to his car, Randy offers to come with him, to which Mike agrees. Randy would later recount that Mike's hands were sweating and he was shaking, gripping the steering wheel. He was pale. I asked him what was wrong, and he said that things were happening at the house that he couldn't explain. The boys quickly arrive to find the family in chaos. Phil is prepared to do battle with whatever force is within the house, and the girls are staying close to one another, attempting to comfort each other. As they try to determine a course of action, all the lights in the house go out. They then begin to hear banging and scratching coming from the crawl space. Flashlight still in hand, Phil, with the backup of his family, shines the light towards it and begins to make his way towards whatever this thing is. It seems like with each step he takes, the sounds become louder, and after a tense several seconds, he opens the door to the crawl space. Inside, they find that the fireplace that was once there has been completely disassembled. Its bricks have now been stacked in an elaborate pile directly in the middle of the small room. The amount of effort and strength required to perform such a task convinces all of them that whatever they're dealing with is strong, persistent, and perhaps uncleansable. Nonetheless, with their spirits waning, Clara makes a desperate call to Father Al, who agrees to come earlier than originally planned and makes emergency arrangements for himself and his paranormal expert of a friend to come out that night. They arrive as soon as possible. The paranormal expert is a man by the name of Alex Tennis, a well-respected paranormal researcher and psychic whose abilities were studied at the American Society of Psychic Research. Together, they make their way to the door of the Dandy House, hoping to help rid this family of whatever seems to be stalking them. After being let in, the family quickly leads the pair to the crawl space to show them just what they were talking about. Although he was aware that some sort of activity was taking place, Alex had not been given any additional details or information in regards to the home, its history, or happenings. As he steps into the crawlspace room, he begins to have a vision. In his vision, he sees multiple dead bodies stacked within the crawlspace itself. After the vision subsides, Alex begins to explain to the family what he saw. He believed that many had passed away within the home itself, some of natural causes, and some of murder. It was his conviction that based on what he saw, that the house used to be a stopping point for a stagecoach, or perhaps some kind of inn where people would stay the night before departing the following morning. It was also his belief that there was a nearby criminal or gang of criminals that would often rob and kill nearby travelers, and that perhaps these souls somehow became trapped here. When someone passed or was found dead nearby, being the only stopping point in the area, their bodies would be placed in the crawl space until they could receive a proper burial. It was also his belief that there were 7 different spirits that were trapped within the home altogether. With this revelation, the family, Alex, and the father pray that the trapped spirits within the home find peace and be released, so that they may go on to their final destination. Upon the pair's departure, Clara once again has renewed hope. The home, as it did the first time around, seemed to be cleansed and to be more peaceful. Meanwhile, Mike and his friend Randy were skeptical of Alex's conclusions. After he left, they used an old map of the area to trace where he had said the old stagecoach route was. They did indeed find what they believed to be an old trail that could have been used for such a thing, and the trail passed right by the dandy home. But during their search, as they were following the trail out and headed back to the house, they experienced strangeness of their own. As they began to trace the trail, they began to see what they described as orbs of light in the nearby trees, and these orbs began to come at them. Randy, having never seen or experienced anything supernatural before, began to have a panic attack. Upon arriving at the house, they were fortunately able to get him calmed down. By this point, it was late in the night, and the entire family needed to try and get some form of sleep in order to function the following day. Randy ended up staying the night since he had rode with Mike. Once everyone else was settled down for the night and fast asleep, Clara sat by herself, weeping. She felt that her and her family were helpless in the situation, and that all efforts had been exhausted, and that they needed to move. The only problem was that all their money, every last dime, had been sunk into the house, leaving them stranded. She would continue to contemplate the future and would cry herself to sleep that night. The following morning, as the family began to wake up and start to try and resume some form of normalcy, Mike went ahead and departed with Randy to take him home. Several hours would go by, and Mike hadn't returned. Finally, there was a knock on the door. It was a police officer. He informed the family that there had been an accident and that they needed to head to the hospital as soon as possible. Rushing into the car and to the hospital, the Dandy family wondered just what had happened. There had been no mention of Randy by the officer at the time. Upon arriving, they were briefed that Mike had lost control of his vehicle and crashed into a nearby ditch. He was now undergoing emergency surgery. He had extensive head injuries, a ruptured spleen that may have to be removed, and that he had lost a very significant amount of blood. As they waited for the outcome of their son's surgery, the Dandies were once again greeted by the officer who had knocked on their door. He explained to them that Randy had indeed been dropped off, and that Mike had wrecked on his way back to the Dandy residence. But as he was being loaded into the ambulance, he kept saying that there was another person in the car with him. And although they believed him to be confused on account of his injuries, they went ahead and searched the area nonetheless, but another person was never found. After 2 weeks of being in a coma, Mike finally wakes up, but unfortunately has no recollection as to what exactly happened to him to cause the accident. Clara, however, believes that whatever presence that's been plaguing their lives had to have been responsible for what happened to her son. After months of recovery for Mike and continued paranormal activity within the home, Father Alphonsus would return with Alex one last and final time at Clara's request to try and rid the home of the evil and persistent force that had drained the life out of all of them for years now. However, this time, just the father and Alex would perform the cleansing inside the home themselves. As they moved from room to room, Alex would once again experience multiple visions of the past. His visions would tell him that of the 7 spirits who he believed to be within the house, one was that of a young man who had been in some kind of a war or battle near where the property sits now. Another was that of a young girl who had passed from some sort of very painful illness in what was now Tina's room. And there was another spirit that seemed to be keeping herself and others trapped within the house. It was the spirit of a woman who was incredibly angry and resentful. She continued to be possessive, depressive, and just as angry in death as she was in life, refusing to pass on. Believing what they had identified to be the source of the paranormal activity, Father Al decided to take a different approach to the cleansing itself. Although an exorcism cannot be performed on a place, but rather has to be performed on an individual, the rites themselves could in theory be performed or added to a series of prayers to try and use their strong cleansing powers to clear out a home such as this one. So that's exactly what the father did. He began to perform the rites of exorcism within the house itself. As the prayers began to exit his lips, varying with intensity as the rites often do, the home began to literally shake, and the horrific moaning and wailing that had made itself present in the very first cleansing seemed to return with a vengeance. Every horrible feeling, banging, knocking, and scratching noise that the family had experienced thus far was present and seemed to be magnified. It takes hours, but eventually the rites are finished. As the dust settles, so to speak, the home seems peaceful and blissful, like it did when the family had first visited and decided to buy the home. And again, for 3 more months, the family lives in peace. But like the persistent force it has manifested itself to be, the haunting begins again. The Dandy family, despite their best efforts, simply cannot take it anymore, decide to cut their losses and move. Unable to find a buyer for their house, they eventually declare bankruptcy. Shortly after this, Phil and Clara would also divorce, bringing a sad and bitter end to what was supposed to be a rural redemption for the Dandy family. However, this wouldn't be the end of the story of the Hinsdale house. Eventually, the home would come into the possession of Daniel Klaus, who currently owns it. Daniel is a renowned paranormal investigator and has been involved with the likes of Nick Groff and has made appearances on tons of national TV programs centered around the paranormal over the years. Having been raised in a haunted house, this led to a lifelong fascination with the paranormal for him. After years of restoration, it is now available for both investigations and tours, and is still considered a very active paranormal portal, and is kept open as a paranormal research location. It's even staged in the 1970s period to maintain the integrity of when the hauntings were initially known to have began. But now that we know the backstory of the 20th and into the 21st century of the Hinsdale house, just who owned it, what happened to them, and who owns it now, I would like to shift your attention to some of the plausible theories as to what could have caused the haunting. Many theories of what could have caused the haunting have been formed over the years by the many people who have researched and have been interested in the case. One theory is that the home was built on top of an Indian burial mound. This, of course, could have disturbed the spirits of the natives that rested within the land. And although tribes who used this method of burial were present in the area back in history, there is little to no evidence to support this claim. But perhaps any evidence by this point could have long since been lost to the sands of time, or could have been removed when the home was initially built. Another theory is that the home was at one point used as a stagecoach inn, and passerbys were murdered either near or within the home itself, leading to their spirits being trapped within the home or on its land. Although there is evidence that a stagecoach route did run very close to the home, there isn't direct evidence that the house itself was used as an inn, but it is possible. Murders also did take place in or around the area in which the home is now located, which could lend credence to the theories of criminals robbing and murdering people along the stagecoach route. An old family from the area that used to own the home, with the last name of McMahon, also lends credence to the home being used as an inn at some point. The now passed grandfather of the family used to tell stories of a road that passed by the house where stagecoaches traveled. Another theory is that one or several of the spirits were trapped as a result of hangings that took place there. The now famous hanging tree that sits near the residence was indeed used for executions for a time. Most famously, it seems, was the execution of a woman named Elizabeth, and Elizabeth was pregnant. Could this perhaps be the spirit of the woman who was angry and refusing to leave? Other events, such as a homicide that took place in the year 2000 near the house, as well as a buzzsaw incident that led to a boy's death, have led many to believe that whatever haunts the area could indeed still be there and influencing our world. It's important, in my opinion, to try and get the story and the facts as straight as possible, not only for the current owner's benefit, but for the dandies who have suffered greatly as a result of their story becoming public, especially towards the end of their time at the property, as word got out that something strange was taking place at the house. A local paper ended up reaching out to the dandies for a statement, thinking that they were accepting an opportunity for additional outside help. They gave their story, only to be met with ridicule from the paper, which in turn led to ridicule from the public and nearby residents. Which this, combined with the paranormal torment they were experiencing, along with then having to file bankruptcy and then later divorce. In my opinion, they suffered greatly and did not benefit from the story, especially during that time. The only benefit I've seen could be from Clara Miller, formerly Clara Dandy, who would eventually write a book known as Echoes of a Haunting. But to be fair, if I experienced even a portion of what she did, I would eventually write a book to catalog what happened as well, not only for some monetary benefit, of course, but for my own sanity, really. So as I've begun to mention, and will continue to mention again in the future, if you ever encounter anyone mentioned in this video or any of my other videos, whether it be in person or online, please be respectful of them and their experiences, and do not ever harass anyone. And if you find yourself seemingly handed an opportunity that seems too good to be true, the answer to your prayers, it's more than likely not the case. It could be a nightmare waiting to happen. It could be a haunted home infested with entities, sitting and waiting for the perfect victim. Don't let it be you. Could an item, if given enough energy, devotion, and focus, begin to take on a life of its own? Could it begin to exhibit human-like characteristics, as if it has been imbued with or contains some kind of soul or entity inside of it? This act of magic has been practiced by multiple religions and cults throughout the ages. This is just one very strange example that it could indeed be possible. After a gracious gift was placed into the arms of a little girl, tragedy would strike, and what follows would continue to haunt the family, the citizens of the village, and would soon cross far beyond the barriers of land and sea. This is the untold story of Okiku, the haunted Japanese doll, and the bizarre paranormal force that possessed it. Japan is a very mystical and spiritual place, a place where the souls of the past seem to interact with the living. Such places where this spiritual energy seems to be most visible is throughout many of Japan's spiritual temples. Home to many religions, the two main ones being Buddhism and Shintoism, thousands of temples exist all over the country. But one in particular houses a spiritual artifact that has a tragic backstory and an even more terrifying story that continues to be written to this day. Located in Hokkaido, Japan, at the Meninji Buddhist Temple, is a doll with a bizarre and tragic backstory indeed. Although there are several origin stories of how the doll came to be and how the temple became its final living space, so to speak. All of them have most of the main details in common. Therefore, I'll be telling the most agreed upon origin story to try and be as true to the legend as I can. The year is 1918 in Hokkaido, Japan, and a 17-year-old boy by the name of Okiku Suzuki is in search of a gift for his little sister's birthday. As he pursues the different vendors and small shops, something soon catches his attention. In one of the store windows, he spots a small, childlike doll wearing a traditional Japanese kimono. Knowing that he had finally found something his sister will love, Okiku quickly purchases the doll and makes his way back home through the countryside. As the family celebrates their little girl's birthday, Okiku is presented with the doll, and almost immediately, as soon as her eyes meet hers, she falls in love with him. The two from this point become inseparable. Wherever Okiku is, her doll is right by her side. She combs her hair, bathes her, dresses her, and treats her as if she was her little sister. The two even share meals and sleep side by side. The joy that the doll brought Okiku must have filled Okiku's heart with such happiness, but soon that happiness would change to tragedy. One hot day, as the little girl played outside with her doll, she was bitten by a mosquito. This benign insect bite would soon manifest itself into a horrible case of malaria. Although the family did everything they could possibly do, Okiku would pass away, scared and gasping for air as she clutched her special doll, all the way until the moment she took her last breath. Devastated, the Suzukis planned to have their little girl buried with the doll since she loved it so much, but unfortunately, due to either governmental or religious oversight at the time, this wasn't an option. Instead, after they had laid Okiku to rest, the doll would be placed on a small family shrine located within the living quarters of their home as a tribute of sorts to their late daughter and their love for her. But shortly after the doll was placed on the shrine, very strange things began to happen. Okiku, upon walking past the shrine one day, noticed that the doll's hair seemed significantly longer than what it had been when it was placed there. The hair, which was originally shoulder's length on the doll itself, and black, was now overgrown, with differing shades of brown hair also coming through and splitting at the ends. Finding this bizarre to say the least, he brought the discovery to his parents' attention, and unsure of what else to do, they trimmed the doll's hair. As the days came and went, the family began to have distressing dreams at night of their departed Okiku. Sometimes she would be scared and alone in the darkness, calling out to them, only being recognized by her voice. Other times, she would blame them for what happened to her. Each member of the family at differing times had these dreams, and they would soon lead all of them to believe that Okiku's soul wasn't peacefully resting. These disturbing dreams soon became all the stranger when the doll, which they began to refer to as Okiku in their daughter's honor, would appear by their bedsides, following these nightmares. One such incident involved the father of the family waking up in a cold sweat, only to be met face to face with the blank and lifeless stare of the doll. Unsure of what was taking place, the Suzukis turned to their faith. After contacting a local Buddhist priest and having a cleansing ritual be performed on their home and the doll, the activity seemed to grow and become stronger. Accompanying their ever-frequent nightmares and random movements of the doll, the chilling events grew into full-blown spiritual manifestations. During their waking life, they soon began to hear banging noises all throughout the house and the whispers of a little girl. Strange disembodied voices, varying from high-pitched, like those of a child, to the low groans of something unexplainable, began to be heard. their lights began to flicker on and off, and the paranormal activity seemed to happen more frequently as the calendar ticked closer to the birth and death dates of Okiku. These strange and terrifying happenings would continue over the course of the next 20 years, with multiple religious priests and shamans being contacted, and all coming to the same conclusion that after the cleansings failed time and time again, that the restless spirit of Okiku now inhabited the doll she once loved so much. Finally, needing a major change and unable to deal with the ever-intensifying spiritual presence that seemed to haunt their home, the Suzukis relocated to a different district. Believing the doll to be the source of their various ailments and emotional torture that they had endured over the last 2 decades, they had no desire to take it with them. The family had reached the conclusion that if their daughter's soul wasn't at peace, what could perhaps be helping to fuel Okiku's power, or magic, was the close proximity of her grave to their home, where the doll resided. So in order to distance the doll from the grave, the family approached the Meninji Buddhist temple in Hokkaido, and over the years, the doll's reputation for being haunted had spread throughout the community, and indeed the majority of the country. This was more than likely due to the various interactions between the spiritual community and the Suzuki family. Finding the doll to be mesmerizing and possibly a unique opportunity to commute and interact with the dead if the stories were true, the leaders and priests of the Meninji temple agreed to home Okiku permanently. As with many legends, we find lots of details to be exaggerated over time, and perhaps some of the details to not be true at all. And this is what the priests were originally thinking, that perhaps due to grief, the family was dealing with other spiritual ailments, perhaps unrelated to the doll, or causing the doll to be a vessel of sorts for restless spirits. However, as the years came and went, as Okiku now called the temple her home, they began to slowly but surely experience the same strangeness the Suzukis had for all of those years. Okiku's hair continued to grow, and this baffled the priests. They would eventually have the hair trimmed and tested, and the hair was said to belong to a little girl. They found that the entity seemed to be appeased when her hair was trimmed and combed, and this led to less activity for a time, but the same activity, the knocking, banging, and disembodied voices, would soon plague the temple as well, and Okiku's power only seemed to grow. Any priest who seemed skeptical of the doll or attempted to cleanse it themselves soon had their dreams haunted as well, turning their sleep into restless fits. Their homes and rooms soon also began to manifest the very same activity that the temple was now exhibiting. With no remedy seeming to work, the leaders turned to appeasement instead, hoping that gestures of goodwill would keep the entity at bay. As years turned to decades, and as we've come into the 21st century, the priests of multiple generations now have overseen and cared for the doll known as Okiku. And though some of the more violent activity has faded, the general consensus is that she is now just as powerful as she was, or is perhaps more powerful as she's continued to age. It seems like as the more her fame and notoriety grows, the more visitors she has, the stronger she becomes. She continues to invade the dreams of those who come to visit her, and her hair is growing faster and more frayed. She is said to drive tourists mad who doubt her, with many people even reporting that besides seeing her strange hair and feeling a malevolent presence when visiting her, they've also had her stalk and appear in their dreams. Some more disturbing and recent reports have even suggested that her mouth is slowly opening, and that if you dare to peer inside of it, you may just catch a glimpse of baby-like teeth sprouting from her porcelain gums, as if whoever or whatever she is slowly turning to flesh and bone. The paranormal displays of her power continue to occur as well, Her permanent home, located within the Menaging Temple, is her own private shrine where she sits in a small wooden box on display. It is here that she watches and waits for anyone and everyone who dares to play with fire and invoke the power of the entity known as Okiku. But what are your thoughts? Was Okiku the girl trapped inside of the doll? In my opinion, although her spirit would be much older now, at the time of her death, she was either close to or was 3 years old, and no person at that age is capable of true malice, to the point to where she would become aware enough to begin to blame her parents and then torment them for decades to come. As children, our parents or our family are our entire world, so I find it incredibly difficult to think that these bizarre happenings were the result of her soul being restless and imbuing the doll. What I find more likely, and all the more interesting really, is the thought of invocation or the imbuing of the doll, like a conduit or a vessel of sorts. Okiku the girl was, as they said, inseparable from this doll. She fed it, bathed it, took naps with it, and everything else a small child would do with that wonderful imagination that they have. But could all of this dedication and focus, accompanied with the tragedy that took place, allow for a portal to open for an entity, whether non-human or a restless human spirit, to inhabit the doll? And by non-human, I mean a demon. This would make sense to me. Something that enjoys and grows more powerful off of pain and misfortune, or the emotional torment of others. As it causes the pain, it feeds off of it and grows ever stronger. This would not only explain the malevolent manifestations of whatever entity is present, but would also explain the still present force and the alleged ever-growing power of it. And depending on the entity's strength, it could also explain why the cleansings thus far have failed. However, if you find yourself taking a trip to Japan anytime soon, or you happen to call Japan home, if you find yourself in Hokkaido, you may want to steer clear of the Menaging Temple, because if you don't, the entity that inhabits the doll, known as Okiku, may just use you as its next feeding source, where it'll begin to plague your dreams, making you twist and turn, sweat and fear, as it grows ever stronger and attempts to cross from its world into ours, making our plane of existence its permanent residence. An unsuspecting family finds what they believe to be the perfect home, but underneath the facade of this charming farmhouse, there is a sinister force, dark as the abyss. Lying underneath the heavy fog upon the land, there lies generations of graves. And these graves could hold the key to solving their paranormal nightmare. This is the untold story of the old Arnold estate, also known as the Conjuring House, and the demonic forces that dwell within it. Harrisville, Rhode Island, a small town located on America's East Coast, with just a population of an estimated 1,800 people. Like many towns across the country, you could easily overlook this one at face value. But it's when we take a deeper look, we discover that this little town has a dark history. Its story is filled with death, from murders to drownings and much more. With all these unfortunate happenings in mind, it makes one beg the question, could there be something evil that stalks this place? Something that feeds upon suffering and misery? Perhaps there is. And perhaps that is what contributed to the creation of the following story. It all starts in Central Falls, Rhode Island in 1970, where the Perrone family, which consisted of Mother Carolyn, Father Roger, and their 5 daughters, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cynthia, and April were all living a relatively normal life. Among things like school, work, and outdoor play, nothing seemed quite out of the ordinary, yet. The children had been gifted a puppy with an exceptionally unique personality, and out of the ether, a name came to mind when they were naming her, Bathsheba. A unique dog with a unique name. She was fond of all the children, but especially Andrea. Now 10 years old, she would often take Bathsheba for walks around their suburban neighborhood. However, on one of those walks, tragedy would strike and would seemingly set in motion a snowball effect that would follow the family for years to come. While Andrea had the puppy out in the neighborhood, her sisters had come up from playing outside and decided to make the walk a group activity. All seemed fine until a car full of teenagers drove by at an incredibly high rate of speed. They seemed to be yelling something in unison and had brightly colored tassels hanging out of their windows. Bathsheba was an obedient dog, but the flailing and bright-colored streamers caught her attention, and in an instant, she broke loose from Andrea and bolted towards the vehicle. The shocked girls then watched the car miss her by mere inches as she made her way safely across the road. But being the good dog that she was, upon hearing Andrea call out to her again, she began to run back to them. And in the blink of an eye, she was struck by another vehicle. An elderly couple that never even saw her. Her leash had gotten caught around one of the wheels of their car when they hit her, and she was suffering immensely. A nearby neighbor called the police, and upon removing the children from the scene, they were traumatized further as they heard the gunshot that ended the poor animal's life. The entire family now held a deep despair at the tragedy that had taken place. She wasn't just a pet, she was a member of the family. And there was now an unspoken pain that haunted them. The family had planned a vacation months prior and hoped that a break from their normal routine would help everyone. So they went. And soon, some of their sadness turned to joy as the family experienced hotel swimming pools, ice cream, and shopping. But this joy would too be short-lived. The family also had 4 cats, and upon returning to their home with this newfound sense of well-being, they would endure even more trauma. They would discover that almost all of their cats had been viciously killed by neighborhood kids while they were gone. Several had every bone in their bodies broken with a baseball bat. Upon this horrific discovery, their father Roger rushed inside the house to call the police, only to find their home absolutely ransacked as well. Furniture was upside down, mirrors and windows broken, all of their provisions left to spoil from their tipped-over fridge, and their carpet was doused in motor oil. It would later be discovered that 2 of their cats were killed by the group of the kids. One would never be seen again, and the other had been seriously beaten, but would survive. Although the neighborhood was known for angsty teenagers and roughhousing kids, the family wondered, how could these kids conduct such evil? Did the devil's foot soldiers know no bounds? A police report was filed, and it was shortly uncovered that the demon seed who had led these awful actions was their 12-year-old neighbor. The young man was seemingly a born criminal. Upon being confronted, the boy's mother covered for her son, and despite their best efforts, due to lack of evidence, nothing much would come of the report with the police. But Andrea would have her revenge. She had yet to come to terms with her precious Bathsheba's death, and now this, the rage inside of her built. After some thorough planning, she attacked the boy who was responsible, beating him ferociously, breaking his nose, blackening his eyes, until she was pried off by a nearby neighbor and told to go home. All this wouldn't bring her animals back, but it felt justified to the young girl, given what the boy had done. But these antics of sadness, hostility, and rage would soon manifest into something much darker. Ever since their home was ransacked, Carolyn had wanted to move, but knowing they weren't in a financial state to do so, they had little to no choice other than to stay. So she kept an ever-watchful eye on her children, letting them out of the house rarely and mostly under her supervision given the prior events. She wanted them raised by wild nature, not wild beasts. Shortly after this time, Roger had prepared to depart for a business trip, which was to last several days. Even amidst the turmoil of the current events, he still had to provide for his large family. And while his family was just waking up that morning, as he and his wife Carolyn enjoyed their morning cup of coffee, they were suddenly startled by the sound of a large explosion in their front yard, like someone had fired a cannon towards their house. Alarmed, they raced outside to discover what had happened. Shortly after purchasing their humble home, Carolyn had built a rock garden of sorts at the entrance of their driveway. Her friends often teased her that its centerpiece resembled a tombstone without the inscription of the dearly departed. Well, to the family's shock, their neighbor from across the street had started his truck that morning and had suffered a major heart attack and had died at the wheel, his foot pressing down on the gas, causing the truck to barrel directly at the parents' home, to smash right into that large rock. It was almost like something was following them, like a living, breathing organism, feeding upon it. After this horrible event, people began to refer to the rock garden as the graveyard. Mrs. Curtis, the wife of the neighbor who had passed away, upon being greeted and offered condolences by the family, actually blamed them for what had happened, declaring that Carolyn never liked them anyway and was a witch. That was enough for her. Again, she begged Roger to move, but they were seemingly stuck. Given the awful circumstances, the man still had to work, so he departed for his business trip. While her husband was gone, it was up to Carolyn to take care of their 5 children. This meant taking them to and from school, as well as music lessons, and much more. While attending her daughter Andrea's music lessons, she had forgotten to bring a book to help her pass the time, so Carolyn went and purchased a paper as a substitute. Before too long, she found herself daydreaming and looking through the various ads in real estate available, wanting and wishing that she could change their current predicament, when strangely enough, the universe seemed to glance back at her. Hidden among many other homes was a 9-bedroom farmhouse with a barn, lots of land, and seclusion. Its beautiful design and elegance soon had Carolyn imagining her children playing and being raised in nature as she wanted, and she could allow them to do so without the fear of other children attempting to harm them. She almost immediately became obsessed with the idea of purchasing the house. And although the family really couldn't afford it at the time, without seeking Roger's permission, she made a call and went to look at the old Arnold estate the following day. The owner was a very nice old lady, and although she didn't have much, Carolyn asked how much she would have to put down to hold the home so she could purchase it once her husband had returned. An agreement of $500 as a good faith payment was made, and shortly after Roger arrived back home several days later, he was sideswiped by his wife's decision. Although his anger would soon turn to understanding. After all, a happy wife makes for a happy life, as most would say. Even though he didn't know exactly how they would make it work, he decided to placate his wife and allow them to purchase the home. It took some time, but before too long, they found themselves packing and coming into possession of the keys to their future, although they couldn't foresee just how dark of a future it was to be. The Perrin family, having seemingly found the home of their dreams, located on a large swath of land outside of the town of Harrisville, Rhode Island, what would become known as the Old Arnold Estate almost seemed too perfect, like an answer to their desperate prayers. It's a large farmhouse which has 9 bedrooms, a barn, and plenty of land which they can envision their children playing on and having a wonderful time. Although it's winter, they go ahead and begin to move into their new house. There's a massive snowstorm taking place while they're moving in, but this doesn't deter the large family from getting settled in to what they believe is going to be a charming, nice, and new home for all of them. Given everything they've been through, I would have hoped for the same, and for the first 3 months, things are charming, nice, and normal. Their rustic farmhouse has its challenges, with it being fairly old, such as being very cold that winter, but it's nothing they can't deal with, or so they think. All around, the feeling is a happy one for the family, but this happy mood would soon change. Upon meeting their nearest neighbors, they seemed rather strange. They offered one piece of advice to Roger and Carolyn. For the love of your family, keep the lights on at night. Originally written off by the couple, these words would seem to be rather fitting foreshadowing for the events to come. When the frozen land of the farm began to thaw, it seemed like something thawed along with it and began to plague them once again. One night, when the daughters Nancy and Andrea were asleep in their shared room, they were suddenly woken up by the sound of their door slamming open and closed, open and closed. Petrified by the noise of the door smacking the wall, and it also being their only way out of the room, they ran towards the door to try and escape, when suddenly it stopped moving and just stayed open, still creaking from being moved. Catching their breath and trying to come to terms with what had just happened, thinking by this point maybe one of their other sisters was trying to play a prank on them, the 2 girls looked down the hall and eventually made their way to their other sisters' rooms, where they found them asleep. Needless to say, they wouldn't sleep for the rest of the night. They would bring this to the attention of their parents the following morning, but were quickly dismissed, as is often the case, and told that they had overactive imaginations. From here, things started small, but became very noticeable as they mushroomed into much bigger experiences. At first, whatever spirits they believed could be in the house seemed benevolent, almost good-natured, with some of the younger siblings later stating that they would even be tucked into bed by the spirit of a woman on occasion, but that was all too short-lived. Items soon began to go missing. Car keys weren't where they had been hung. Daily items such as mugs, toys, and utensils were soon disappearing as well. Carolyn would hear the scraping of a broom upon the floor, or the knocking of a kettle in the kitchen when no one else was home but her. With this, upon cleaning the floors, she would also find piles of dirt that would appear out of nowhere, making her feel as if she was going crazy. But these small happenings, too, would soon become larger. The children would often play a game called hide and clap, a version of hide and go seek. And this time, Andrea was the seeker, and her sisters went off hiding throughout the estate. Cindy made her way into the woodshed and found a small box just big enough for her to get inside. Being determined to win, she climbed into the box and slid the small lid over the top, figuring this would be an excellent hiding place indeed. And after several minutes, she realized that no one was coming for her and went to remove the lid. Except it wouldn't budge. Panicking in utter darkness, she used all means necessary to try and remove the lid and free herself. After screaming and worrying that she'd suffocate inside this box, she was thankfully found by Andrea, who slid the lid off no problem and revealed her horribly distressed younger sister inside. It's important to note that this was a sliding cover. There was no locking mechanism. Along with this terrifying event, the children's rooms were often rearranged daily. They would leave their things one way in the morning and return to things either completely a mess, as if a small cyclone had hit their rooms, or all items would be smashed underneath their beds, and this happened to all of the girls at one point or another. These small whispers, bangings, and movements did indeed become larger. Andrea, being the oldest, would often be woken up by her younger siblings and would hold them as they sobbed their eyes out, terrified to return to their rooms. Cindy in particular began to hear a sinister voice call out to her almost every night. The voice would tell her that there were 7 dead soldiers in the walls and would repeat it over and over and over again. The children, now terrified, begged their parents to believe them. And although they too were beginning to experience things on their own, they didn't want to frighten the children, so they did what could be done to placate them. But soon, the entire family began to hear the wails of something inhuman calling out for its mother. This disturbing trend with no origin was followed by even more disturbing happenings. The beds of the girls would lift up and shake by an unseen force, almost always around 5:15 a.m., as if something was trying to send some kind of a message, although it was never clear just what that message was supposed to be. During the day, the apparitions of spirits began to manifest and stalk the halls of the old Arnold estate. These were soon coupled by the horrible stench of rotting flesh wafting throughout the house. Soon the girls weren't the only ones whose doors were slamming open and closed, and whose beds were lifting up on their own. Soon it was affecting their parents as well. One night, Carolyn woke up suddenly to the figure of an old woman over the foot of her bed. Her hair was like a sack of cobwebs, with little tendrils hanging off. The woman's head was also bent and hanging off to the side of her neck, as if it was horribly broken and mangled. Her gnarled mouth screaming at her with an echoing voice. "Get out," she shouted, over and over again, until she suddenly was no longer there. The Perrin family continued to endure a living nightmare as the traumatic paranormal activity persisted and continued to scale in intensity. How does one fight an enemy he can't see? Something he can't touch or feel, attack, or defend against? This question and more must have ran through the heads of Roger and Carolyn, as they not only feared for themselves, but especially their children now. As their offspring's natural protectors, how anxiety-inducing must it have been to know that they were powerless to stop what was terrorizing all of them each and every night. In an effort to try and understand what was happening to them, Carolyn began to research the history of their house and was shocked by what she found. Over 8 generations of the Arnold family had lived and died within the home, some by horrible means. According to the Black Book of Burrillville, the town's former public records book, these included 2 suicides by hanging, one within the family barn, one by poison, the assault and murder of a young girl named Prudence Arnold by a farmhand, 2 drownings in the nearby creek, and 4 men who froze to death, among some of the notable deaths. One death that caught her eye in particular was that of a woman named Bathsheba Sherman. Her name was spelled exactly like their dog that they had previously owned, and her story was as interesting as it was disturbing. Born Bathsheba Thayer in 1812, she married fellow Rhode Islander Judson Sherman in Thompson, Connecticut on March 10, 1844. According to available information from that time, the two had a son named Herbert, and for all intents and purposes, things seemed normal, but that couldn't be further from the truth. After losing 3 children before the age of 7, Bathsheba began to care for her neighbor's children, perhaps to fill the void that such sorrow could create. And it's here where things take a strange turn. While caring for the infant of a nearby family, the infant suddenly passed away within Bathsheba's care. An investigation ensued, and it was found that the child had a puncture wound in its skull, as if someone had taken a large sewing needle and sent it through the child's head. Rumors of devil worship and witchcraft soon became rife, with many believing she had indeed sacrificed her children to Satan, robbing them of their young lives. Although Bathsheba was never punished for the child's death, since there was never a trial, that didn't stop her behavior from becoming increasingly bizarre. She became incredibly reclusive, strange, and dark. Rumors say that she supposedly attempted to murder other children while confessing her love for Satan, before she then climbed atop the highest tree on the estate, cursing everyone before hanging herself. And although that would make for a much more fascinating story, it doesn't seem to be true. The rumors may indeed have been spread, and there are evidence of multiple child deaths, including the infant via a needle-like object. But her tombstone reads her death date as May 25th, 1885. So odds are that she passed away as an old woman. But perhaps given the circumstances, she became more bitter with age. Another strange detail that was uncovered was one of the hanging deaths that took place within the barn on the estate. It was that of Catherine Arnold. She had seemingly out of the blue one day made her way from the house to the barn, gathered a rope, and hung herself from the rafters. She was frozen solid when she was later discovered. It seemed like whatever paranormal force that stalked the land tormented the matriarchs of the families that lived there and fed upon death itself. These supernatural occurrences that now plagued the Perron family were a daily occurrence, and they soon also began to physically touch the family as well. Poking soon turned to pushing. A hand on the shoulder soon turned to slapping, scratching, and more. One day, when Carolyn was reading a book in the living room, she felt a piercing pain in her calf. Upon further examination, she saw what appeared to be a puncture wound, like that of a needle, with a small dribble of blood now coming out of her leg. And these attacks didn't stop here. Carolyn soon believed that it was Bathsheba who was causing the majority of her problems. The spirit seemed to hide her things daily, making her feel as if she was going insane, while simultaneously lusting after her husband. In later interviews, Roger would state that he never felt threatened by her spirit, and that he only ever saw her sweeter side, such as comforting touches and the feeling of an embrace. To the contrary, his poor wife experienced much, much worse. Andrea Perron also in later interviews said that the whole family believed it was the spirit of Bathsheba who was mostly tormenting Carolyn, as if she saw herself as the matriarch or the mistress of the house, and that Carolyn was some kind of competition, an obstacle between her and Roger's affection. On the verge of losing her mind and being tortured daily, The family was barely holding things together. Most of all, Carolyn. She had vented to a friend of hers named Barbara about what she had been going through. And strangely enough, this friend just so happened to attend a lecture that was being given by renowned paranormal scholars and demonologists, Ed and Lorraine Warren. It was Barbara that actually told the Warrens about the parents and their struggles. Intrigued, they were put into mutual contact with one another, and before too long, the Warrens arrived at the front door of the old Arnold estate. Upon stepping into the home for the first time, Lorraine Warren noticed a heavy and malevolent presence. Upon further convening over the course of several weeks, the couple told the family that they indeed were being haunted by the spirit of Bathsheba, and that she had made a pact with Satan himself after sacrificing one of her children to him. She then hung herself on the property in order to haunt it forever. This is why the family was often seeing the mangled-necked apparition of the woman with wispy hair. This was apparently her. Over the course of several months, the Warrens would visit the old Arnold estate in order to try and assist the family with ridding themselves of the spirits, but it was all to no avail. All of these events seemed to culminate with a seance one stormy night. The Perrons, Roger, and Carolyn, along with the Warrens, were joined by a priest and a fellow medium to conduct a seance to try and establish further contact with the entities within the home, to understand just why they were plaguing the family. The girls were confined to their rooms upstairs and were not allowed to partake in the ritual. The ritual was conducted in the basement, one of the alleged sources of the dark energy, according to Lorraine Warren. And in the middle of this ritual, Carolyn seemingly became possessed. As she exhibited violent behavior, she was restrained to a chair in order to prevent her from hurting herself and others. The entity that now inhabited her body claimed to be that of Bathsheba. And before everyone's eyes that was present, Carolyn began to not only speak a language that was unrecognizable, but in a voice that wasn't her own. She then began to levitate in the chair and flew across the room. Although they were forbid to witness the event, as curious children often do, Andrea, along with her sister Cindy, snuck open the basement door and watched the events unfold for themselves. Their testimonies are also where some of these details are sourced from. Carolyn was now mangled and distorted, her body twisted in an unnatural position. After several hours of attempting to cast the spirit out, she finally went limp and lay catatonic on the floor. After his wife had seemingly been freed, Roger called the entire thing off. He was not only concerned for his wife's well-being, but his children's as well. And although the Warrens were trying to help, things just seemed to get so much worse when they were there. So disregarding their advice, he threw them out and forbid them and their associates from ever investigating the hauntings at the old Arnold estate ever again. Later in life, a 77-year-old Roger would recall she was possessed. Her entire body was distorted, and it lasted several hours until they de-demonized her. Then I threw them out. I couldn't take it anymore. The family's torment would continue with varying intensity until 1980, when they were finally able to sell the old Arnold estate and move to Georgia in a bid to rebuild their lives. Finally, they were free of the horrible events that had plagued them for nearly a decade. But all those happenings, all those traumatic moments, would never be forgotten by any of them. They all realized that they were truly lucky to have escaped with their lives, as well as their sanity. Going back and not only reading various interviews, Andrea Perron's books, and watching interviews with the family, They not only seemed genuine, but really had nothing to gain by claiming to have experienced these things. They truly seemed like they had suffered. I mean, they threw out the Warrens, which is interesting in and of itself. But if I saw my wife twisted and exhibiting demonic behavior, I probably would be pretty freaked out as well. The story of the haunting of the old Arnold estate and the Perron family was used as the basis for the Conjuring movie, in which they were also used as consultants for accuracy's sake. And the film does, of course, take liberties, as most Hollywood films do, but it's a good one for sure. But having watched this video, you're now probably aware of what really happened. Since the selling of the home, reviews have been mixed by other residents, with one lady claiming that the home wasn't haunted at all, and even condemning and suing the Conjuring filmmakers for causing her distress through trespassers, and others stating that the home is still very well haunted indeed. More current owners, who we'll call Corey and Jennifer, welcomed the spirits and the history of the home when they moved in. Claiming to have only slept in the smaller wing of the estate for the first 4 months that they lived there, they didn't want to overstep their boundaries with whatever was haunting the property. When they finally opened up the door to the wing of the larger part of the house, the very same night, they both claimed to be woken up by a shadowy figure. Their couple would say that it was pitch black in color and peeking at them from behind the door frame. Although most people would be terrified at the prospect of dealing with a shadow figure of any sort, the couple understood that they were guests in this home, even though they had purchased it, and were just excited to have experienced anything. But they also admit that although they do continue to experience strange things from time to time, it's nothing like what the Perrons say they experienced. Nothing quite as malevolent or evil by any means. Despite criticism and support, the Perrons to this day remain adamant that their story is true. With Andrea saying in an interview with USA Today, "Both my mother and I would sooner swallow our tongue than tell a lie. People are free to believe whatever they want, but we know what we've experienced." Prior to her death, when asked about the events of the haunting, Lorraine Warren claimed that she still felt traumatized all these years later about what had taken place that stormy night during the seance at the old Arnold estate, saying that the things that happened there were so incredibly frightening that it still affects me to talk about it to this day. She, of course, was reunited with Ed on April 18th of 2019. God rest her soul. These days, people who have visited the house, such as various paranormal groups, researchers, and fans of the Conjuring universe, have described feeling multiple things first stepping in the home. Some claiming to see shadow figures, others a feeling of a heavy presence to the point where it makes them nauseous. And regardless, there certainly does seem to be something there. All around, I think the haunting, given all the research I've done, is more than likely legitimate. There's too many sources backing up what took place, not to mention the family didn't gain anything from experiencing what they did, and surviving members still claim it's all true to this day. If you'd like to learn more, I'm listing the sources I used for research in the description below, as well as various links to Andrea Perron's books, which tell the full story of her and her family. I, of course, am not affiliated with her or anyone else involved in any way. I just find them to be an interesting and very useful resource. So if you find yourself in hard times and are presented with what seems like a gift from the universe, just know that if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And the dream home that you can't wait to live in could be infested with generations of death and despair, demons which could still be lurking and stalking the property. So my advice, if it sounds too good to be true, it is. And please, research a home's history before you buy it, or you may be stuck with a decade of paranormal torment, or worse, you may become its newest permanent resident. Can death unleash something into this world that isn't supposed to be here? Could it act like a portal, allowing something sinister and dark to creep in just before it closes, especially if the person passing is harboring dark and abhorrent secrets? When a young man begins to exhibit strange and demonic behavior, and the very laws of nature seem to bend to his will, can a reverend work to save his very soul? Documented by multiple law enforcement professionals as unexplained to this day, this is certainly not a story you will want to miss. This is the untold story of Don Decker, also known as the Rain Man of Pennsylvania. The date is February 24th, 1983, and on this cold, misty day, a family is mourning the loss of their loved one, a man by the name of James Kishaw. After battling alcoholism for many years, the bottle finally took its toll and caused cirrhosis of the liver, which became fatal. Among the pews of friends and family paying their respects sits a young man, the grandson of James, 21-year-old Don Decker. Don had been granted furlough from his 4 to 12-month jail sentence for receiving stolen property in order to attend the funeral. But as he sat facing the body of his grandfather, as others paid their last respects and gave glowing speeches about the man, Don clenched his fists. Only he harbored a dark secret that no one else knew, and this secret is perhaps what contributed to his troubled adolescence. When it was his turn to walk up and say goodbye to James, as he stood over his body, the face of evil looked back at him with eyes closed for the first time. Don would later say, "It felt like good triumphing over evil that day, and I truly felt like everything was going to get better, like it was a turning point in my life." The secret that he had been holding on to for so long was that James, his very own grandfather, had abused him from the time he was 7 years old until he was a teenager, and no one else knew. All the years of pain and fear were caused by that man, the very same that now laid in the coffin, the very same that Don was now having to hear others praise, and who he was publicly obligated to mourn. At the conclusion of the funeral, when James' casket was laid into its final resting place, he couldn't stand the way his parents had glorified the man's memory. But given the circumstances he was in, furloughed from jail and with emotions raw amongst everybody, he decided it would be for the best to go and stay the night with some family friends instead, before he was set to return to finish out his sentence. Bob and Jeannie Kiefer were longtime friends of the family and were quite fond of Don, so they were more than happy to have him join them for the night. As the night progressed, the three of them were enjoying each other's company, but it seemed like all the feelings that had been stirred up from the memories of his grandfather's abuse at the funeral were coming back to haunt Don. He felt on edge and uneasy when suddenly the air around him vibrated with a bone-deep chill. Almost simultaneously after this occurred, water began to drip from the ceiling and down the living room walls. Don then fell into an eerie, trance-like state, staring at nothing and yet everything at the same time. The Kiefers were perplexed at what was happening and tried examining all reasonable possibilities. Thinking they had a leak, they contacted their landlord, a man named Ron Van Wy. Upon arriving, Ron too quickly became perplexed. The leak, or so they thought, was obvious, but what was strange to him was that there was no piping that ran through the front part of the house, certainly none that could spring a leak from the ceiling or the walls. None at all. On top of this strangeness, When observing the water's direction, Ron noticed that there was indeed no sense of direction. The water was not only coming from the top down, from the ceiling and the walls, but it was going from the floor and up the walls, in direct contradiction to the laws of gravity and to anything that he had ever seen. Shocked and needing multiple witnesses to assure himself that he wasn't crazy, Ron phoned his wife Romaine to come and take a look as well. Upon her arrival, she was just as perplexed and became scared at what was happening, since it defied all logic, and the leak, or so they thought, only became worse. So the landlords did the only thing that they could do. They called the police. Shortly after that call, a patrol car arrived with Officer John Beaujean, who, after briefly stepping inside the home, became drenched in water, and also witnessed the bizarre, otherworldly activity to which he had no explanation for either. So to prove his sanity and to back up a report, he called upon his partner, an officer named Richard Volbert. When Richard arrived, he wanted to be briefed on exactly what was going on, but Beaujean didn't want to give him any sort of a preconceived notion, and just told him to trust him on this one. After some back and forth, Richard finally conceded and followed John into the Kiefer residence. He would later describe the incident as so. I walked in the door. I couldn't have gotten 2 steps in the door, and I was pelted by water. As we were discussing a potential leak, and as we were being told that there were no pipes in that part of the house, as we stood just inside the house, a droplet of water was traveling horizontally and passed right between us and out into the next room. As I retell this story, I have a chill up my spine and the hair on my neck is standing up. John would go on to say, things were happening in this house that I couldn't have ever possibly dreamed of happening, and there was no way to explain what was going on. Shocked by what they were witnessing, the 2 officers asked the family to step outside of the house and out of the water while they left to report the incident to the chief himself. The Wise decided to stay at the property while the Kiefers and Don walked across the street to a local restaurant for something to eat. Within seconds of everyone departing, the water suddenly stopped within the house. And aside from the home being drenched, it was back to normal. No more dripping water, and no more mist. This left Ron and his wife only to speculate that whatever was happening was coming from one of the 3, because when they left, so did it. Pam Scrofano, who owned the pizzeria opposite the Kiefers' house, where the 3 ended up in, was a friend of the Kiefers, and knew Don as well. Upon greeting the 3 of them, she noticed that Don was distant, like he was looking at you, but looking through you. A deeply religious woman, she sensed something evil about him, like the devil was working through Don Decker, and recommended that they contact someone at the church for help. Within mere seconds of mentioning this, droplets of water hit the table in front of them, and soon the very same phenomena that was originally happening in the house was also now taking place inside the pizzeria. Sensing this evil, Pam ran to the cash register where she had an old cross necklace. She took it out and placed it around Don's neck. As soon as it touched his skin, he got burned. He began to scream and pull the necklace off of him. It was charred black. As the trio departed the pizzeria and headed back to their home, the strange activity inside once again ceased. It's important to note that nothing like this had ever happened at the Kiefer residence or Pam's pizzeria. No plumbing issues, nothing that could be considered even remotely similar. Convening inside the home once again, they met Ron and his wife. Ron suspected that Don had something to do with what was happening, and after some discussion, an argument erupted among the group. This led to Jeannie screaming at Don, telling him that they knew it was him and that he had to make all of this stop. After the words left her mouth, the pots and pans above the stove began to shake, and the lights around them began to flicker. Don Decker was no longer in control of his body. Everyone watched in horror as Don levitated multiple feet into the air and rotated several times. He was then thrown out of the kitchen where they were and into an entirely different room. Don himself would later recount the event like this. It wasn't like someone grabbing your hand or picking you up. I felt this force over my entire body. I'm a big man and I've always been assertive, but this, whatever this was, made me feel like a newborn child. I'm scared right now just thinking about it. Don now laid unconscious on the floor, and the rain began again. The Wise and the Kiefers were in absolute shock and disbelief at what had just taken place. They knew it was tied to Don, but they had no idea just what it was. But they felt that it was evil. A few hours after the strange incident witnessed by the police officers, they arrived back at the residence alongside their very heated police chief. As he made his way into the home with the two officers behind him, he too was pelted with water just as they had been. And at first, probably feeling like he was on the spot and perhaps slightly embarrassed, he claimed that this wasn't even a police issue, but a plumbing issue, despite then being told that there were no pipes in that part of the house, and this was even confirmed by blueprints of the home. After taking a look around at the rest of the home, which was bone dry, the chief then angrily ordered the two officers to escort him back home. He would be the only officer that night to not admit to anything strange happening. He then directed officers John and Richard to not file a report and to not speak about the incident at all, but word would get out. The following morning, acting against the specific orders from their chief, the two officers returned to the residence, along with 3 veteran officers as well. They too would see and experience the bizarre rain inside the home, so they decided to try something to attempt to get to the bottom of what exactly was going on. They asked if they could place a paper bag over Don's head, to which Don agreed. This was so he would have no way of seeing anything. He'd have no preconceived notions of what could be placed on him or in his hands. They then placed a gold cross necklace from one of the officers into his hand. Lieutenant William Davies, one of the officers present who placed the cross into his hand, described the incident like this. As soon as the necklace touched his palm, he said it burnt him. He would have had no idea what it was. I saw what I believed to be smoke of some sort coming from the necklace or his hand. As he dropped the necklace, I picked it up, and it was hot. Not burning hot, but hot enough to concern me. Then, suddenly, with the force as if a bus hit him, he lifted up and was thrown across the room, hitting the back wall. Upon removing the bag from him, he was clearly dazed and had 3 bloody and fresh claw marks across his neck. I've been a cop for 40 years, and I've never ran into anything like this, ever. Never before, and never again after. There's always an explanation, but in this case, there was no explanation. The police would later leave again with no answers as to what was taking place, believing it to be a spiritual matter. Don was placed on the couch in the living room, where the rain continued to go from mist to showers at random and varying times. After making multiple desperate calls to every Protestant and Catholic religious leader in Stroudsburg, only one didn't turn them down. Ron was able to convince an evangelical preacher who went by the name of Reverend Johnson to come over and pray with Dawn. As she arrived and began to pray, The rest of the group held hands in vigil and did what they could to support her. As the first words left her lips, Dawn began to convulse and shake. The rain intensified, and his body began to twist into unnatural positions. But as she continued, he slowly but surely began to relax, and the rain seemed to stop. Although those present believed that a miracle had been performed, the results of that prayer session would only prove temporary, perhaps placing into hibernation whatever was inside Don Decker. Once his furlough was over, Don Decker returned back to jail to finish his sentence, and within just a few days, the mysterious rain returned. Upon his return to jail, Don was placed in a cell with another inmate and had the thought enter his mind that if he could make it rain in the cell, perhaps he could get to be alone. Almost as soon as he thought that, the rain began. It was materializing out of the concrete floor and flowing upward. The other inmate was horrified and screamed for the guards to let him out. Thinking they had some kind of plumbing issue, the guards opened the cell and removed that inmate as well as Decker. At first, he was accused of throwing water onto the walls from the sink or from the toilet by the guards, but upon these accusations, Don rebutted with, "I can control it." This time, the feeling was different. This time, he felt powerful and in control. Upon hearing this, the guard laughed and said, "If you can control this rain, make it rain in the warden's office," an offer that Don couldn't refuse. The warden would then describe what happened, and these are the words of Lieutenant Warden David Keenhold. "I was in my office filling out paperwork with no one else around. It was approximately 8 p.m. in the evening. I didn't notice it at that time, but my shirt was dripping down. I heard a knock at the door, and little did I know that it was the same officer that was just with Don Decker. I wasn't aware of the situation at the time. He told me to look at my shirt, and there was no explanation as to where the water could have come from. The officer then became very frightened of what had happened, and after explaining the situation to me, I too became frightened. Shortly after the rain in the warden's office, a frantic call was placed to a local chaplain, a man named Reverend William Blackburn. He soon found himself shaking hands with the warden and several officers as he was escorted into the jail and into an empty cell. Within minutes, he came face to face with Don Decker, who by this time was beginning to fear the feeling he had inside of him. That powerful and evil feeling. He was now asking for the Reverend's help in freeing him of whatever this thing was. Blackburn wasn't convinced at first. He told Decker that his life would be much easier if he just stopped all this nonsense and attention-seeking. He would go on later to describe the situation like this. "Almost immediately after I accused him, Don's demeanor changed. A glazed look came over him, and a horrible smell entered the room. Doctors, nurses, and medical personnel will tell you that when you walk into a room when there's someone dying of disease or of cancer, there's a smell to it. I smelled that smell, multiplied by at least 5 times. It was evil and foreboding." Don's glazed expression then switched to one of malice and calculation. He exclaimed, "I have powers that you don't, and I can make it rain." He then raised his hand and rubbed his fingers together, and it started to rain inside that cell. It was like a devil's rain, a mist. I was in the presence of evil. I started opening my Bible to begin to pray, and Don said, "I don't want you to pray for me," to which I decided to anyways. I started to read to him, and the strange thing is that even though I was soaked, the pages of my Bible never got wet, and that was truly frightening. Although the session was short, upon uttering the words that he was now bound in the name of Jesus Christ, the rain stopped, and a peace overtook Don. When he finally came to, he thanked the Reverend with tears in his eyes, and the two hugged and prayed together. Again, in the words of Reverend Blackburn, "There is no doubt in my mind that he was possessed. No human being could do what he did in that room. There is no way that he did anything to fool me whatsoever. Whatever happened was spiritual, and it was not from God. I can guarantee you that it was not from God." From this moment forward, the rain has stopped, for now. Don Decker would later say that he takes things day by day, and that fortunately, the rain hasn't returned. As for his grandfather, he thinks whatever happened was related to him. He thinks that, considering where he thinks he ended up, maybe he was able to make a deal with someone and have yet another chance to abuse him. What makes this case so unique and interesting is that all the people involved are credible people. I mean, we have some family friends, sure, but they stated they had nothing take place in that house prior to Don's arrival that morning. We have the landlord of the family's home and his wife not only reaffirming that there weren't any prior issues, but that there were no pipes in that area of the house. We then have 6 police officers, including the chief over the case, experience the phenomena, and he was the only one that said that nothing took place. We have a business owner where the phenomena took place at her establishment as well. Then several guards at the jail, in which he goes back to finish serving his time, witness things, and the warden of the jail himself. And the police officers, 3 of them were seasoned lieutenants, I might add, and anyone with a proper reputation, unless they really experienced something, would risk that, in my opinion. So was it demonic infestation, possession, poltergeist activity, or something else entirely? When we have so many credible eyewitnesses recanting the same details, saying what they saw, experienced, and felt was a phenomena not of this world, it truly makes you wonder. And if it wasn't spiritual, could Don's childhood trauma have allowed him to break into a part of the mind that could somehow cause these kinds of things? Allow him to manipulate the weather of his surroundings, move objects, and even cause harm to himself? We may never truly know the answers to this mystery in particular, and it very much still is a mystery to this day. As far as an update on Don Decker, besides multiple show appearances and interviews to discuss his story over the years, the last known activity that I could find of him was that back in 2012, he was charged with arson of a local restaurant in the Poconos Mountains of Pennsylvania. It seems like perhaps he was paid to set fire to the establishment by the owner, maybe for insurance fraud. As far as the outcome of the case, I couldn't find additional details. Perhaps whatever evil that was inside Don got the best of him at this time. Or, we're all human. We do make mistakes without otherworldly influence as well. Just a thought. Wherever he is, I do have to say that his story is an amazing and intriguing one, and I wish him nothing but the best. I'd also like to say thank you guys for watching this video. Without you guys, this channel is just me making videos that I find interesting at home, at my computer. And I really can't hammer home how much your support means to me. It seems like YouTube doesn't always want to promote my content, and that's been a big uphill battle over the last 4 years. So when you choose to watch Mystery Archives, just know it helps me out much more than you could ever know. Rob and Vicky Graves had found what appeared to be their dream home, looking to escape the big city life and take up a more rural one for themselves and their 2 teenage sons. They found Fox Hollow Farm and were shocked at how affordable it was for the sheer size and quality of the property. Sensing that it was too good to be true, they asked what could possibly be wrong with it, because at a passing glance, it seemed absolutely gorgeous. Then it came to Rob. He had remembered the name from a news broadcast many years ago. Unbeknownst to him and his wife, they were now standing on the very same grounds that were once owned by Herb Baumeister. the notorious serial killer. They immediately brought this up to the real estate agent who was showing them the property, and were immediately told that that was indeed the case. That the private investor had indeed purchased the estate from the widow of Herb following the disturbing discovery of the bodies back in the 1990s, but that it had been completely remodeled from head to toe, removing any and all remnants of what it looked like when the murders had taken place all those years ago. But that's why it was indeed so affordable, because no one wanted to live there due to the history. After some further discussion among the couple, they ultimately decided to purchase the property. Within a couple weeks, the family moves in and falls in love with Fox Hollow Farm. The teenage sons soon make it a habit to play outside and then wash off in the pool in the basement, soon tracking dirt and gravel all throughout the home. One day, Vicky is vacuuming up the dirt that the boys had brought in from the outside around the pool, when suddenly her vacuum loses power. Believing that perhaps she had accidentally unplugged it from the outlet, she plugged it back in and continued her work. Within several more minutes, it happened again. Perplexed this time because she was even more aware and careful about the cord and the outlet, she knew she hadn't unplugged it. So she plugged it back in and triple checked that it wasn't just falling out of the outlet by pulling the cord. Ever more aware this time, she goes back to vacuuming, but keeping a present eye on the cord itself, and to her amazement, it pulls out on its own, as if someone had grabbed and pulled it out of the socket. Startled, she drops the vacuum and is beside herself. She doesn't know how to make sense of what had just happened. And this would just be the beginning of the strangeness that would occur. Rob worked at a car dealership, and one of his employees was a man named Joe. Joe had been a great employee, but had a problem of being chronically late most of the time. As he probed to figure out what was going on, Joe informed Rob that he lived over an hour away and really needed the job and would be willing to move closer if the opportunity presented itself. Well, Rob thought about it and ended up offering Joe a place to rent. Located on Fox Hollow Farm, they had a guest house that they were considering renting out as apartments for quite some time, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to benefit everyone involved. Joe would indeed move in just a few days later. It takes several hours, but within that time frame, they're able to get everything inside and finish the move. Exhausted, Joe decides to retire for the night with his dog, Fred. As he lays down to sleep in his newly set up bed, he then finds himself in a horrific nightmare. He's being chased throughout Fox Hollow Farm by something he can't see. The dream is so intense that it causes him to sleepwalk, which wasn't something that he was known to do. He began to run while still dreaming, and ran directly into the door frame as he tried to escape the guest house. Falling back, he knocked into a nearby glass of water, which fell and shattered, cutting his hands. The impact and cutting of his hands finally woke him up, and he was forced to sit back and ponder just what had taken place. And things would only intensify from here. Another day soon after, Rob was painting the side of their home a different color. As he and his wife remarked on how nice the finished job will be, she spots something out of the corner of her eye. She had seen a man in a red shirt staring at them. As she broke away from her husband and began to approach the figure, it started to walk away from her and quickly disappeared as if it never existed. The couple then called out and checked the perimeter, but never found anyone. They dismissed the person as nothing more than a curious trespasser. I mean, after all, they did purchase a serial killer's home. They just had to accept that curious people may sneak up just to get a look at their home. Later that night, Joe is doing the dishes in his apartment when he suddenly gets a series of knocks on his front door. Telling the person it'll just be a minute, as he dries his hands off to go and answer the door, the series of knocks begin to grow louder and more aggressive. Thinking it was extremely strange or extremely urgent concerning Vicky or Rob, he went and answered the door as it was still being knocked upon. However, as he opened the door, there was no one to be found. Automatically on guard, he peers outside. The knocking had been happening when he answered the door, so no person could have got very far while he answered mid-knock. He glanced around, and yet saw and heard nothing. He stepped outside and began to examine the roof and the nearby areas, and still there was nothing. Thoroughly weirded out at this point, he made his way back inside and bolted the door locked behind him. He started to make his way back to the kitchen to finish doing his dishes, when he spotted a man standing in his bedroom, staring at him. Upon spotting the figure, his dog begins to growl and makes sounds that he's never heard him make before, staring directly in the direction of the bedroom. Already on edge, he ran into the bedroom and flicked the light on, only to discover that there was again no one there. Searching the entire apartment, he again found nothing. Trying to rationalize and clear his mind, he decided to take his dog Fred for a walk to calm down and unwind for the evening. While on his walk around the property, he thought to check on Rob and Vicky's house to see if the lights were on. This would indicate to him that perhaps they were the ones who had knocked on his door, and therefore he could rest easy and figure out what it was about the following morning. However, upon arriving at their house, he found it completely blacked out. They had already gone to bed for the night. Fred, who was always a loyal and obedient dog, always walked with him without a leash and would always follow his commands. However, tonight would be a different story. Deciding to head back to his apartment, he motioned for Fred to join him, but the dog would not budge. He suddenly began to growl and then bolted into the nearby tree line. Instinctively, Joe ran after his dog, but not before seeing what his dog was running after. Before his eyes and the very same tree line was a man in a red shirt. Although he was absolutely terrified, Joe couldn't let anything happen to his beloved dog, so he continued to run towards this man, when suddenly, whoever or whatever this was disappeared before his eyes. Although slightly behind, he would quickly catch up to Fred and now noticed him not acting aggressive at all, but rather showing his belly in submission, staring in the direction of Joe. Joe, knowing his dog, knew that something very strange had to be up with him. He suddenly felt as if someone was staring directly at him. He slowly turned around to see the apparition of a man in a red shirt with a twisted face staring back at him just several feet away. Joe, as most of us would, ran out of there as fast as he could, his loyal companion following him. The two run as fast as they can back to the apartment, where they rush inside, lock and deadbolt the door, and nervously watch out of the blinds for the rest of the night. The following morning, an even more exhausted Joe makes his way to Vicky and Rob's house to discuss the prior night's events. As he's telling both of them what happened, Vicky starts to become emotional. She too had seen the man in red just days earlier. She points to where she saw him, and lo and behold, it's the exact same spot that Joe had encountered the entity the night before. As the day progressed to night, Joe yet again found himself in his apartment, hoping to finally get some rest. But as he settled down in his bed, he was suddenly startled by knocking at his door. As he yelled out, "Who is it?" as he made his way towards the door, he didn't receive an audible answer back, just more aggressive knocking at the door. The door itself now was shaking. Facing his fear of the unknown, mid-knock, Joe throws the door open, only to meet face to face with nothing. As he frantically looks around the yard while holding the door, he notices that the door's knocking apparatus is sticking straight out, as if someone is holding it. It then drops one last time, knocking the door. Absolutely petrified, Joe slams the door and locks it. As he tries to catch his breath and takes several steps backwards, he sees the doorknob begin to turn. Then, without warning, the door bursts open, shattering the lock. The open door yet again reveals no one. After a moment of frozen terror, Joe runs outside and into the front yard of his apartment, screaming and searching all around for just who could be doing this. After several minutes, he stares back into the house through the open front door and sees a man dressed in all white standing there. He's soaked from head to toe in what appears to be water and is screaming in a muted voice, as if he's being held underwater. He then bolts towards Joe and seemingly disappears into a mist. Frantically calling out to his dog Fred to accompany him, Joe frantically makes his way to Rob and Vicky's house on the property. He's so terrified that he's shaking now, and Rob and Vicky are just as scared. They now truly believe that they are dealing with something paranormal in nature. In order to rationalize the situation and make sense of what was taking place, they begin to believe that they're experiencing the results of the murders conducted by Herb Baumeister, and that his victims are either trapped here somehow, or their energy is stuck in an endless loop, replaying their final and tragic moments over and over and over again. Refusing to return to his apartment, Rob and Vicky, being the supportive friends they were, agreed that Joe could stay the night with them, and together they would begin researching online to try and formulate some kind of a plan of action of what to do next. As they collectively scour the Baumeister case information, they find themselves looking at the list of identified victims. As they get deeper into the details, Joe is shocked. He stops them on a picture of a man in a white shirt. That was the man I saw in my apartment, who was soaked from head to toe and screaming. Although this information still scares them, it does help reassure them that they are indeed dealing with the victims of this horrendous tragedy. They are especially convinced, considering many of the remains have never been identified, so they continue to research the case. After several uneventful days, Joe finds himself almost compelled to walk around the property with his dog, except this time in broad daylight. So, apprehensively, he makes his way with Fred to the area where both he and Vicky had seen the man in red on separate occasions. Just past the tree line on the walking path, Joe is stopped by what looks to be a bone. He believes that it's impossible that such a bone could have been missed during the extensive searches over the years. But nonetheless, it was right here, right now, as if it had been placed there for him to discover. Quickly consulting and showing Rob and Vicky the discovery, they too believed that this could be a bone belonging to the mysterious man in red. They ended up contacting the lead detective on the Baumeister case and submitted the bone, which turned out to be a human femur bone, in as evidence and for analysis. They then requested if the investigator himself could come out to the property and explain to them just where things had taken place so they could have a better understanding of what had happened, to which he obliged. Several days passed, and Joe by this point had made his way back to his apartment to try and settle back in given the new information. While on his computer checking his emails, he began to hear a scraping, almost metallic-like sound originating from the kitchen. Upon further examination, he sees that all of his butcher knives from his knife block have been neatly arranged in his sink, placed in a row, equally spaced from one another. Glancing around the room, he spots fresh, deep cuts in the wood of the nearby counter cabinet. He believes that this could be a sign for one of the victims crying for help. He starts to try and figure out the mystery. He takes out his phone and begins recording, asking probing questions to whoever or whatever could be there, in hopes of helping them in any way that he can. Prior to this, of course, he turned off any and all appliances that could interfere with the process. He begins by asking a series of questions and doesn't seem to get much of anything, at least not audibly. But then towards the end of his questions, Fred begins to growl, the same eerie growl he had any time they had experienced something previously. Taking this as confirmation that perhaps his companion could see or hear something that he couldn't, he quickly downloads the audio file and begins to listen to it on his computer. And to his shock, he did indeed receive a response. This is the clip of the actual EVP that was recorded.
Who keeps walking in the kitchen?
He believes he hears the married one. But in all of their research, all of the victims were young, single gay men. The only one who was married was one Herb Baumeister. This revelation is startling. He not only believes that the victims were trapped within the grounds of Fox Hollow Farm, but that perhaps the serial killer himself could too be trapped here. What would follow would be dozens of paranormal investigations. And those investigations would lead the group to believe that they were not only dealing with the spirits of the victims haunting the grounds, but either a dark entity impersonating Baumeister or the killer himself. Several years after the events, the Graves family would end up selling Fox Hollow Farm, and it would continue to change hands over the years since then, leading to multiple new owners of the property. And although new information doesn't seem to be publicly available, it's still considered one of the most haunted places in Indiana, if not the world, given its unique and gruesome history. An independent film would go on to be made about it, called The Haunting of Fox Hollow Farm, and Robert Graves, along with another man named Richard Estep, who led many paranormal investigations at Fox Hollow Farm, would co-write a book detailing the family's creepy experiences and what they believed to be ultimately happening. So in conclusion, we know that Herb Baumeister was mentally ill ultimately, but what makes this case so strange and so compelling to me is that he was an outstanding member of his community. For the longest time, he was the smiling neighbor, the charitable businessman, the happy family man, and overall, a pillar of normalcy. But behind closed doors, his psyche, his soul, contained a darkness that most of us will never be able to comprehend, yet alone unravel and understand. So could the murderous deeds of a twisted individual trap souls on a property and perhaps open some kind of a portal? Could the unleashing of such energy, like what is expressed in a violent death, contribute to something like this? If it wasn't what's known as an intelligent haunting, where the spirits are aware of what has happened to them and are indeed trapped there, which very well could still be the case, then perhaps it could be a residual haunting, where the events are of such magnitude and strength that they play on a loop for all time, but the souls who were involved have long since moved on. These are questions that we may never have answers to, but all things that we should ponder. But one thing is for certain: the malicious calculation of Herb Baumeister and the horrendous things that he did to the suspected 25 victims at Fox Hollow Farms should never be forgotten. They are indeed still identifying and using updated technology to identify remains that are still being found on the grounds. This has happened as recent as November of 2022. So if you happen to be a family member of someone that you suspect could be connected to this case, just know that my heart truly does go out to you. And please, contact the Hamilton County Coroner's Office at 317-770-4415. Besides remembering what happened, I also urge you to please respect the victims and their families, as well as the family of Herb Baumeister, if you should ever have anything to do with them. Throughout history, it has been speculated that many have been plagued by an ancient demonic force. From Mesopotamia to more modern times, this evil and terrifying entity has said to enter our world and wreak havoc upon those who dwell within it. When a seemingly normal family disregards the warnings and partakes in multiple Ouija board sessions, what happened next nearly destroyed them. This is the untold story of the demonic Zozo House of Oklahoma. and the abhorrent creature that stalks its walls. Oklahoma City, a small but growing city in the heartland of America, known for blue-collar work and brick-and-mortar shops, red dirt, and sports, would soon become known for something much darker. A teenager by the name of Darren Evans was growing up here, a normal boy by all accounts, doing things that any teenagers would enjoy, hanging out with friends, shenanigans here and there, and dating girls. He began dating a girl named Brandy who attended school with him, and the two often found themselves visiting each other as often as they could, whether that was walking to and from school, in between classes, or visiting each other's homes. One day, while Brandy's home was having some plumbing work done on some pipes located underneath the house, the plumber doing the work would soon make a strange discovery. Located below the foundation of the home, covered in dirt, was an old Ouija board. The front letters were partially buried, and the back of the board was solid black in color. Off to the side of where the board was found was an aged planchette. What made this finding even more bizarre was that 4 old jars sat on the corners of the board, speckled with dirt as well. Thinking perhaps the kids had stashed the board away and forgot about it, the worker told the young couple after his work was done about what he had found. And it's from here that things seemingly take a darker turn. Upon examining the discovery, they began to brush the dirt away from the jars. They were then shocked by what they found. Inside each one of the jars, sitting on the 4 corners of the board, were the decaying bodies of blackbirds, congealed blood and matter still present. Bewildered but intrigued, they sat the jars off to the side and picked up the board. As soon as his fingers made contact with the board, Darren seemed to have an instant connection with it. And with this soon came a burning curiosity to examine it. And this curiosity would manifest into obsession. With this, the couple took the board inside the home, where they spoke with Brandy's mother. She actively practiced the Wiccan religion, but had no idea who could have put the board there. Several days later, curious as most teenagers are, Darren was an avid music fan, and one night, after building up the courage to do it, he decided he was going to contact the deceased singer of the popular band AC/DC, a man named Ronald Belford Scott, using the board. Scott had passed away from alcohol poisoning in 1980. After lighting several candles, laying the board with letters facing towards him, and placing the planchette upon the board, he began his session. At first, nothing seemed to happen, but Darren was still feeling this otherworldly connection to something within the board itself. After trying for half an hour, to his shock and amazement, the planchette began to move. Slowly at first, it then frantically began to move by itself, moving from Z to O, Z to O, over and over and over again, spelling out the name Zozo. Shocked and unsure of what or who he had contacted, Darren said goodbye in an attempt to end the session. Before his eyes, he saw the planchette spell out, "See you in hell." and then it threw itself across the room. A now terrified and bewildered Darren ran out of his room and tried to make sense of what had just taken place. But this was just the beginning of what was to come. It started with horrible night terrors. He would wake up unable to move or speak and would hear whispering in his ears. These episodes at night were soon followed by banging and knocking throughout his house during the daytime, as well as a constant feeling as if he was being watched by something he couldn't see. But despite the presence he was feeling, Darren now sought answers to his ever-growing list of questions, just what exactly he had uncovered. So, he continued to hold sessions with the board, for better or for worse. Darren would later quote this: "The sessions now were as intense and paranormal as anything I've ever witnessed. A deep and terrible moaning could be heard emanating through the walls after these sessions. I developed sleep paralysis and became reclusive to society in general. I was once again messing with Zozo and Ouija boards, despite the terrors of my earlier sessions, in which I had promised myself I would never do it again. But again and again, I did." When not in use, the board was kept in a purple silk cloth and stored in his bedroom closet. It would also often go missing, sometimes for days on end. When checking back where he had placed it in order to set up and initiate a new session, the board would seemingly vanish, only to reappear at random times, as if it was the one calling the shots of when it could be seen and used. The years came and went, and the sessions on the mystical Ouija board continued. Darren, by this time, started inviting his friends to partake in the sessions, and although their sessions with him would prove he's not insane, it's of little consolation considering the tragedy they would seemingly manifest later on. Darren's best friend was a man by the name of Randy. The two had bonded over their love for the band AC/DC in high school and had been inseparable ever since. Randy's idol also being the late Bon Scott, whose lifestyle seemingly imprinted upon the youthful teens once upon a time, and perhaps would ultimately lead to the downfall of one of them. By now, Darren was living in his own apartment and working construction. At a job site he was on, he would make a strange but familiar discovery. As he was digging down into the earth, he found what appeared to be a jar. Upon picking it up to discard it, he wiped away the dirt and debris, only to be shocked by its familiar contents. Lo and behold, within the jar was a congealed and rotting blackbird, extremely similar, if not identical, to the ones initially found alongside the Ouija board underneath his high school girlfriend's home all those years ago. It was particularly weird, not just because of this, but the fact that he had found it digging down deep into the earth. He wondered, what were the odds of this? And although he had no way of knowing for sure, his gut began to tell him that there was some kind of witchcraft or occult expertise at play here. Perhaps someone or a group of people were knowingly contacting this entity known as Zozo, but for what remained to be known. One evening in 1985, Darren and Randy were relaxing at Darren's apartment when they decided to host a session on the Ouija board. Randy, more than anything, wanted to try and make contact with his late idol, Bon Scott. While wearing a Highway to Hell AC/DC shirt, Randy's intent was clear. The two dimmed the lights, lit a couple of candles, and began the session upon the board. They made contact within a few minutes. Once the planchette was moving, Randy exclaimed, "We want to talk to Bon Scott of AC/DC." With this sentence, the planchette seemingly obliged. It moved in circles, eventually spelling out AYEMATE. The two looked at each other in amazement. The entity was using Australian dialects. And for anyone who doesn't know, Bon Scott was Australian. After several more questions, both of the young men were convinced they were speaking with their idol. The spirit seemed to know every little detail to any question they asked. And during the session, the entity then made a strange request from the men. It asked them to light a cigarette and place it in the hole in the planchette. What proceeded to make both of them laugh also made them quite spooked as well. So they lit a couple cigarettes, one for each of them, and one for this entity. They took a few drags to keep it lit, and then placed it cherry side up in the planchette hole. The planchette then spelled out thanks. They then watched in utter amazement as the cherry of the cigarette lit up, as if Bon himself was taking puffs off of it. But this amusement was short-lived. Once the cigarette had seemingly been smoked, the planchette began to spell something very different. It spelled, "F you, Randy. I will have your soul, and I'll see you in hell. Zozo. Zozo." Terrified, the men quickly ended the session by saying goodbye and tossing the board outside the second-story apartment balcony door. Clearly scared and upset, Randy also didn't take kindly to threats. He began cussing out Zozo with complete and utter rage. The board would later be returned by his downstairs neighbor. And after this session, a series of lows for both of the men seemed to manifest in the years to come. Influenced by the lifestyle of his idol, Randy fell victim to alcoholism. He soon would lose his wife to divorce and have split custody with his son. And although many opportunities presented themselves for Randy to better his life, for one reason or another, he was always just too far away to be able to grasp them. He often said to Darren, "I feel like I'm in a prison, and I can't escape." For old time's sake, the two did one last Ouija board session together in 2005, in which Randy asked the board how he would die. The board responded, in a car, at night, alone. In 2007, after spending the evening with Darren, the last words he would say to him were, "Darren, I will see you in hell." The next morning, Darren received a phone call from Randy's girlfriend, Alicia, saying that Randy never made it home after he left. Instead, he had passed away in a violent head-on collision, ultimately passing away in a car, at night, and alone. This devastating passing, along with the frequent contact with the entity known as Zozo over the years, led to a fascination and borderline obsession with a search for answers for Darren Evans. During the time before and after Randy's death, he had been living in a home in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, that would become synonymous with the demon's name. It was here that the worst afflictions brought on by the entity would take place to him and his family. Darren's fascination with the occult led him to hanging on to and possessing multiple Ouija boards and other various occult objects. It was here that he began to study on a much more in-depth and organized basis, just trying to figure out who or what Zozo was. But this research would soon be interrupted. In this home lived himself, his wife Kathleen, and their young daughter at the time. During a session with his wife Kathleen one evening, while their daughter slept rooms away, Zozo would once again make itself present in their lives, but this time seemed to take possession of Darren. Kathleen trembled with fear and bated breath as something stared at her through Darren's eyes. Something that clearly wasn't human. He then turned violent, attempting to attack her. Fortunately for Kathleen, she was able to say goodbye and get away before any harm could be done to her. Several minutes later, Darren would come back to himself, with no memory of what had taken place. After this session, things seemed to escalate in intensity. Sounds began to wrap throughout the entire home, from knocking to hissing, footsteps and banging, all seemingly with no explainable origin. The family got so terrified that they sectioned off a particular bedroom upstairs, calling it their safe room. One night, however, not everyone was within the safe room. Suddenly, an overwhelming sense of terror creeped upon Darren as he was trying to sleep. He rushed to the safe room to attempt to stop what he was feeling, but quickly realizing he couldn't leave his family behind, he rushed back out of the room in an attempt to gather them and bring them to safety as well. As he was heading towards the stairs, his daughter had heard his cries and was now at the foot of the stairs. It was here that Darren saw her being lifted by invisible hands into the air and carried away from him. Screaming for his child as she screamed for her father, Darren ran down the stairs as fast as he possibly could, but couldn't see her anywhere in sight. He then heard her muffled screams coming from the basement. At first, the door was locked and wouldn't open, but after adrenaline and brute force, Darren thankfully was able to open it. He then retrieved his hysterical child and brought her to the safety of the safe room. Once inside the room, the family huddled together in fear as they continued to hear movement and noises all throughout the house. After this abhorrent nightmare of a situation, the family knew they had to get out of the house. This situation and the many other paranormal experiences had led to a lifelong fascination for Darren Evans with the occult and finding out just exactly what Zozo is. But was it worth jeopardizing his family's safety? It took some time, but the family would soon relocate to another home. And once his family was safe, Darren was able to continue his deep dive into the unknown to try and track down and decipher just what this entity could be and where it came from. And although he knew the topic was vast, I think it went far deeper than he ever anticipated. Whilst trying to dig up more information, he posted his experiences to an old paranormal forum in 2009, and since then, many people have shared their experiences with a demonic force, many of which have been documented and compared by Darren himself on his website. But these experiences are not just a 21st or even 20th century phenomenon. They date back far older than that. Not every fine detail will be mentioned here, but I will do my best to list the most important details that I could find in regards to the origin of Zozo, according to Darren and other online sources. Zozo, in the Old Basque language, means blackbird or crow. The Zo people of Haiti practiced a form of voodoo whose rituals involve horrific scarification, as well as the intake and passing around of bodily fluids and bizarre rituals. Their witch doctors are called Zozo and wear demonic-looking masks. As part of their death ritual, when someone is passing away, they lift up the mask at the moment of death to take in the person's final breath. This is apparently done to absorb the soul of the person to gain more spiritual power. Zozo, also in the Malay language, is the same as it is in English, but it translates to wandering spirit, which is a spirit they believe to steal people's souls while they sleep, which is also bizarre because sleep is often considered the cousin of death. Zozo has been called the minister of deception. It is known to convince you that it is a deceased loved one or friend, or even someone you've idolized, when in reality, it's not. Sessions typically start out friendly and inviting, but soon turn malevolent and dangerous. During his research over the years, Darren made contact with and spoke to famous demonologist John Zaffis, who shared with him that in his experience of over 40 years of studying the demonic and paranormal, the name Zozo and other pseudonyms of its name kept coming up in his investigations, which too led him to seek answers as to what it could be. In some of those investigations, when questioned, the demon stated that it was the son of Satan himself. But Zaffis thinks, perhaps as with many deities that seem to be lurking in the shadows, Zozo could be an entity that's existed far before the founding of Christianity. Besides evidence showing up in Africa and Egypt, there's also evidence found linking Zozo to ancient Mesopotamia as well. Other names Zozo has gone by throughout the ages have been Zuzu, Zaza, and Mama, among many others. The name Zuzu could refer to Pazuzu, the famed demon from the film The Exorcist, which in reality was a demonic entity from ancient Mesopotamian religion. It's incredibly strange to note the following as well. Zozo was replaced in the story of the exorcism of Roland Doe when Peter Blatty was using it as inspiration to write The Exorcist. He changed Zozo to Pazuzu. Zozo is believed to be the demon that possessed Roland. It was described as a terrifying form that first appeared in the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly around 934 to 610 BC. It had a monstrous head resembling a fierce lion or a dog with horns, and had an emaciated human body with clawed hands, a scorpion's tail, and 2 sets of wings. One translation reads, "I am Pazuzu, the son of Hambu, king of the Lilu demons. I have scaled the powerful mountains. They trembled. The contrary winds were headed west. One by one, I broke their wings." Pazuzu and other demons like it were held responsible for ailments like disease, fetal death, nightmares, and much more. Could it be that this ancient demonic force is what could be plaguing people all the way into modern times? The demon Zozo is also mentioned in the French demonic encyclopedia as one of the demons responsible for diabolical possession and corruption. The possession of a young girl in 1816 is noted as a documented case where Zozo, among several other demons, were present. Other noteworthy possession cases over the ages, ranging closer to modern times, that bear Zozo's name, other than the exorcism of Roland Doe in the 1950s, are the possession of Doris Blither in 1972 in Los Angeles, the Enfield poltergeist incident in 1977 in the UK, and as recent as 2012, where a possession incident led to an attempted murder. Other theories with how this entity could communicate with so many people so quickly and across the globe over the years, besides supernatural ability of its own, would be that its own reach is perhaps being strengthened by an egregore, or a collective group of thought form created by occultists for a certain purpose. However, this seems unlikely considering the entity doesn't seem to serve any human interest, other than to destroy the person or people's lives it makes contact with. Egregores are typically formed to bring control over a summoned deity for the person or group's bidding. But perhaps instead there is a cult worshipping Zozo. I mean, that would make more sense to me. People who have made contact with the entity via a spirit or Ouija board have also been asked to chant or spell out phrases in Hebrew or Latin, which has convinced many of the intelligence of the being that they're speaking with. What is also interesting is that the letter Z was actually removed from the original Latin alphabet because it was considered too evil when pronouncing it. It was said that one's face would make a death's grimace, like that of a corpse, and that it mimicked the letter S, like an evil twin. Perhaps the entity uses this name as some sort of mocking, whether to God or something else. One may also ask, despite the origin theories and historical details that could be linked to this ancient demonic force, how would one know if they encountered such a thing? These are what's known as Zozo's calling cards when it's being summoned using a Ouija board. The obvious is there that the planchette will begin to move on its own, but some less obvious signs are there as well, and are as follows. The planchette will move in a rainbow pattern from side to side, spelling Z-O, Z-O, over and over again, also known as the rainbow effect. It can also move in repeating figure-8 movements, like an infinity sign. The planchette will spell out various versions of the demon's name, like Zozo, Zoso, Zaza, Zuzu, or Mama. You may also begin to see shadows moving around the area where you are hosting the session, like you're seeing through the thinnest sheet into a dark world that exists just behind your vision. And you and whoever you may be with may start to feel scared, uneasy, or upset, seemingly for no other reason, before or after this takes place. When you tell this entity goodbye, typically the best way to close a session, it may not truly be goodbye, because oftentimes, depending on how long the session has been for, like an ever-widening door, the entity may have had just enough time to sneak in to begin to wreak havoc upon your life. And thus begins what many demonologists and religious leaders alike call demonic obsession, which is where the entity becomes aware of you and begins to crave you, which then leads to oppression, or begins to inflict various forms of torture upon you in an effort to break you down, whether that's physically, psychologically, or spiritually. It will also work to isolate you from others, especially those who care about you. And finally, if you're incredibly unlucky, possession, where the entity finally takes control of you as its vessel. All of which to me are absolutely terrifying in every imaginable way. Darren Evans to this day continues to research the Zozo phenomena, having been involved in a number of paranormal investigations, shows, and various other public and private events, as well as radio shows and podcasts, many of which he goes into various degrees of details regarding his encounters, other people's encounters, and other various historical details. He also in 2016 compiled his year's worth of research and experiences into a book, also titled The Zozo Phenomena, which you can read and learn more about the entity and the topic as a whole if you're interested. I'll link it below. I also pulled a lot of this information from various interviews, which I'll also be linking below, as well as an older website he runs that doesn't seem to have been updated in a while, but supplied me with much information to get the story as cohesive as I possibly could. I also sourced the photos of the apparitions from this site, some of which were taken by Evans himself over the years. So does this demon or ancient force truly exist? Is it some kind of elder god, a pre-Christian deity or being, or manifestation of occult or Luciferian practices? Did Darren Evans just make it up? And did thousands of people find it interesting enough to make up their own stories and partake in a mass charade that has lasted years? All of these answers may never truly be known, but my opinion is this. I think, not only given the wide array of strange coincidences and details throughout history, from the origins to the stories of this creature existing in distant past to the present, to literally thousands of people, from casual interest in the occult to more hardcore fanatics, religious scholars, demonologists, and more, claiming to have had experiences with this thing. With all of these details in mind, I certainly think it very well could be real. I do think there are things that exist in the shadows, things we can't see or touch, but that are there, watching and waiting to strike when and if the opportunity presents itself. So my advice to all of you, to avoid any possibility of opening a door that you can't close and inviting evil into your life, is this: don't mess with Ouija boards. These things are not toys, and whether you believe it or not, these entities do exist, and they believe in you. So keep away from them, because you might just let something in that won't want to leave, even if you say goodbye. Lying dormant within the streets of suburbia, there is an unseen evil. Like a mouse falling into a pit of snakes, an unsuspecting family disturbed a slumbering force and became enshrouded in a fog of darkness. This is the untold story of the Belair house and the terrifying malevolent entities that dwell within its walls. Belair, Ohio, an area rich in history, was once known as Glass City, having once been a major glass production hub in the late 1800s. It is now known as the All-American Town, having been used in many Hollywood productions as a backdrop for lots of movies, some of which you've probably seen over the years. The town that epitomizes small America's daily life has long since moved past its industrial days and has become known for something else. On the outskirts of the town lies an old two-story Victorian home that has become famous over the recent years, both among locals as well as across the country, with some saying it could be the most haunted place in the United States, if not the world. This is a bold statement to say the least, but the countless visitors to the house have reported strange, disturbing, and unexplainable encounters within its antique walls. But just how did the story begin? Where did the legend of the Belair house originate from? Let us first take a look at the home's dark history. Built in 1887 by a coal tycoon named Jacob Hetherington, the house sits adjacent from ancient Native American burial caves. It is also located where the scene of a massacre took place during the French and Indian War. It would sit on top of an active coal mine, for years before. There was a major explosion that took place within the mine, killing multiple men working deep within the earth, directly underneath the house. Could the culmination of these tragic deaths have opened up a portal within the Belair house? A portal that allowed something to come through that wasn't supposed to be here. Shortly after this explosion is when the strange activity began. Jacob's son Alex moved into the home with his daughter Lyde, but was soon stricken with seizures and hallucinations. He would ultimately be committed to an insane asylum for the rest of his life, claiming that demons were trying to kill him. As time progressed, Lyde would take charge of the family business, being helped by her younger brother Edwin. Lyde would tragically and unexpectedly pass away one morning in the kitchen of the home. Edwin, now alone and grief-stricken, descended into mysticism and the occult in search of answers. He began to regularly host seances in the kitchen where his sister had passed away, to attempt to make contact with her on the other side, and it is believed that contact was indeed made, but with who or what is uncertain. In 2005, Kristen Lee and her family are desperate for a new home. Like a curse, for the second time in less than 2 years, a flash flood has destroyed their home and all of their possessions. Kristen, her 2 sons, Nicholas and Lane, along with their father, Hefe, have been fortunate enough to room with friends during this difficult time. Kristen has continued to try and get the family back on their feet and no longer wants to burden her friends with the boarding of her family. So she constantly checks the real estate listings, hoping to find a home that her and her family can finally settle down into. Given the circumstances, the family didn't have a big budget and would have to rebuild their lives from scratch. But soon, her determination seems to pay off. While at work, Kristen often browses real estate websites for new listings as well as foreclosures, and a new listing soon catches her eye. Recently foreclosed on, but now available for purchase, she lays eyes on the old Victorian home for the first time. Its 4 bedrooms and 2 bathroom setup, along with plenty of room, would be perfect for her family. The price seems almost too good to be true for her budget as well. And although the listing lacks more details, it's like her prayers had finally been answered. But by what? Not wanting to lose the property, Kristen arranges a showing of the home as soon as possible, and before too long finds herself on the front steps of the Belair house. She is immediately taken in by the beautiful craftsmanship of the woodwork. The wraparound porch facing the Ohio River soon has her imagining peaceful evenings watching the water flow. Upon entering the home, she continues to be impressed. Old marble and cherry wood ordain the interior of the home, and it seems almost too perfect, like something straight out of her dreams. The family also has a dog named Bella, and the large fenced-in backyard is perfect for her to run in and the boys to play in. Dumbfounded by her luck, Kristen puts in an offer on the house that evening, and it's accepted the following morning. After 2 years of chaos and uncertainty, the Lee family can finally breathe again and start living a normal life. But just as all seems quiet and settled, the family begins to discover that the house is anything but normal. At first, upon hearing odd noises in the night, the family wrote off the sounds as nothing more than anxiety in an old house. Being slightly scared or anxious upon moving into a new place, particularly following a very uncertain time in one's life, is not out of the ordinary, but these sounds soon become too much to dismiss. They soon begin to hear footsteps at all hours of the day and night. Kristen would later describe the activity as so: I would hear footsteps above and sometimes below me, even when there was no one else home but me, and I always felt as if there were thousands of eyes staring at me at all times, watching my every move. Along with the strange noises, items soon began to go missing, from keys to towels to trinkets. One moment they would be there, and within seconds, they would vanish. And Kristen isn't the only one experiencing strange happenings within the Belair house. At the time, her 12-year-old son Nicholas begins to experience a malevolent force that seems to dwell within his bedroom. At first, he too begins to feel as if he's being watched at all times, and it seems to get exponentially worse at night. He begins to have night terrors, feeling someone or something covering his mouth and nose, forcing him to suffocate. One night, he wakes up in a cold sweat. It's storming outside. Flashes of lightning occasionally light up the room. What he sees disturbs him to his core. In the corner of his room, towards his closet, as a burst of light fills the room, he sees a blackened figure staring at him and shaking profusely. The young boy is utterly terrified. Rushing out of his room as fast as he possibly can, he wakes up his mother and refuses to sleep there any longer. The boy is so hysterical, the only solution was to send him to his grandmother's house, located 30 minutes away. What makes this case all the more compelling is that Kristen has a master's degree in psychology and works as a mental health physician. With this, her professional opinion of what Nicholas had experienced was initially contributed to stress and fatigue, both common factors that tend to make the human mind see and experience things that aren't really there. And these probably could explain many similar situations, and most would agree. However, Kristen's view would soon undergo a radical change after one terrifying experience of her own. After months of strange happenings within the home, it was now winter, and the Lee family, still tight on finances, was sleeping in the basement near the fireplace to save money on the gas bill. Hefe was asleep in a recliner, and Lane as well as Kristen were asleep on the wraparound couch located in the corner of the room. All seemed normal until Kristen was woken up by the feeling of the couch cushion being pressed down near her legs. She then found herself face to face with a terrifying figure of a man staring directly at her. She would later describe the encounter as so: "I woke up being face to face with this gray figure of a man. He was translucent, almost like a mist, but the mist had features, like a person. The face was completely emotionless and had dark sunken-in eyes." Kristen asked, "Who are you? What are you doing here? What do you want?" But to no response, just a blank, lifeless stare. Within seconds, the apparition disappears. But before she can ponder what had just taken place, the silence is once again shattered. But by this time, it was the family dog Bella, who was barking and running around the room. Kristen, attempting to keep her family asleep through the ordeal, tries to quiet the dog down and notices that she can see her breath in the air. And although it's cold outside, it's not nearly that cold near the fireplace. She then sees the figure materialize once more and silently move from one side of the room and through the wall on the other side, vanishing completely. No longer wanting to face whatever this was alone, she woke up her husband and told him what had just taken place. His response, however, was that she was too tired and needed to go back to sleep. Could what Kristen had experienced been a stress or fatigue-induced hallucination? Perhaps, but someone with a professional background such as herself surely would know how to differentiate, wouldn't you think? Finally knowing she's not crazy and totally convinced that the home was haunted, Kristen begins to try and make plans to get her family out of the Belair house and to safety elsewhere. As soon as she can, she puts the home up for sale and moves the family to a nearby rental home. Although she's relieved to no longer physically be in the house, no one is buying it. To try and cover expenses, she has no other choice other than to make the house a rental property. But almost as soon as the first family moves in, they move out. And this kickstarts a revolving door of tenants. Seemingly stuck with the house, Kristen comes to the conclusion that no family will or should live there. So what should be done with a haunted property? Needing to make ends meet, she comes up with a unique idea. She turns the home into an afterlife research property. This would allow various groups to come in and conduct their own research on just what exactly was taking place within the Belair house. And the idea works. Soon, groups from all over the United States and Canada are traveling to temporarily live within the home to conduct research. And from here, we gain some more interesting stories, to say the least. One group, who calls themselves the Armchair Researchers, from upstate New York, consists of two women, one being a birthing nurse, and the other a nurse who works with dying patients. They found paranormal and afterlife research to be a natural extension of their day jobs for the last 15 years. After hearing about the Belair house, they soon find themselves driving to Ohio to investigate the phenomena for themselves. First impressions tend to go a long way, and the first impression the women got upon their arrival was very creepy. The home by this point was in a moderate state of decay. The fence that had once surrounded the backyard was mostly blown down, and the exterior of the home, as well as the porch, was weathered and rotting. But despite the odd feelings initially, they make their way inside. And at first, they actually felt welcomed, almost invited in, greeted by the same cherry wood interior that has greeted everyone. But as soon as they set up their equipment and prepare for their stay, as day turns to night, there seems to be a shift in energy within the home. The shift went from warm and inviting to dark and ominous. Then began the noises, banging, footsteps, and the moving of furniture. The ladies also noted the feeling of being watched everywhere they went. While asking probing questions as they wandered throughout the house, they would soon also witness strange lights in various parts of the home. And along with the lights, there soon also came full-blown apparitions, all of which seemed to be centered around the basement. And as the night progressed, so did their feelings of anxiety. While taking a short break and sitting down on one of the couches in the basement, the two heard what they described as a large crashing noise above them, as if someone or something had thrown a bookshelf across the house itself, shaking the entire home. Absolutely terrified and panicked, the women apprehensively made their way up the stairs and rushed out of the home as fast as they possibly could, leaving behind equipment and personal items. They were too frightened to go back. Upon learning of what had taken place, Kristen wasn't at all surprised. Over the years, there had been dozens of teams of people who couldn't seem to last the night for one experience or another. People have been scratched, pushed downstairs, punched, bitten, and even in one instance, thrown across the room by a violent and unseen force. Another noteworthy story comes from a team located locally there in Ohio. They have had the opportunity to visit the home and conduct investigations numerous times over the years. But their experience in particular one night truly makes me question just what exactly haunts the Belair house. There was 3 of them this time, and it was shortly after midnight when they made their way into the attic to continue their investigation. During their questioning, they seemed to be getting direct interaction with something through their spirit box. Then, towards the corner of the attic, a mist seemed to materialize, coming up from the attic floor, slowly enveloping the group. Glancing down, they were now too stunned to speak. They saw what appeared to be thousands of black snake-like creatures slithering over their feet and onto their legs. The creatures then began to form a figure standing in front of one of the attic windows, a creature of pure darkness that seemed to stare at them with thousands of tiny, beady eyes. The crew, which consisted of 2 men and a woman, ran for their lives, descending the attic stairs as quickly as possible, leaving behind anything and everything that they had brought with them that wasn't located on their person and out of the home for good. All of these stories and experiences have led many to believe that the Belair house is some kind of magnet for paranormal activity, a magnet or a host to a portal for spirits. Whether that portal was opened by the tragedy that took place within the mind that once existed below its foundation, or one that was opened due to seances being conducted within the house on multiple occasions. But over the years, many different entities have been documented, from what appear to be human ghosts to perhaps something more sinister. One such entity goes by the name of Emily Davis. It is believed that Emily Davis was a child that drowned in the Ohio River that flows right by the home. Her room is allegedly the same room that Kristen's son Nicholas once stayed in. And besides the basement, it also seems to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. Through various investigations, once contact has been made and trust seems to be gained, people are often attacked, which have led many to believe that Emily isn't a child at all, but a demon. Perhaps it could be the same demonic creature that frightened Nicholas so bad that he moved out of the home, as previously mentioned. Many investigators also have claimed to have some activity follow them home, and even haunt their dreams, as if the house or the beings within the house are calling out to them to come back for one reason or another. Although many questions may never be answered surrounding the Belair house, one thing is for certain. It continues to be considered one of the most haunted places in America, if not the world. It also continues to serve as a place of study for those wanting to investigate the supernatural forces that dwell within its walls. But if you find yourself being drawn to the old Victorian, just know that if you're not careful, you too could find yourself being made a part of its history, whether you like it or not. Over the years, I've covered a wide array of mysteries, from the Mothman to UFOs, conspiracies to cold cases. And one topic that seemed to resonate more with all of you, and one that I've always found fascinating, is hauntings. Whether that's haunted places, haunted people, or experiences that people have had that they would consider paranormal in nature. So today, I'm trying something new. And don't worry, this is adding content here on Mystery Archives, so there will still be episodes of the untold story for you to enjoy. Those just take a good chunk of time to produce. So, in between those episodes, I'd really like to share stories from you guys, the community, to bring awareness that these kinds of experiences really do happen. And having grown up in a haunted home myself, I know that oftentimes people are hesitant to share their stories for fear of ridicule or for fear of whatever they've experienced flaring up again and reigniting their personal nightmare. This platform will hopefully give their stories justice, have them heard, and give you a glimpse into what people like yourselves have experienced. These are your paranormal encounters. When a young family encounters the devil in the flesh, told from the perspective of a young girl This terrifying tale will have you questioning just what could be happening across the street from you, next door, or even in your very own home. I was almost 7 when these events took place, and I'll be 40 later this year. I lived in the Glendale Apartments in Rock Hill, South Carolina. My baby brother at the time wasn't quite even a year old. Now, my mom was young when she had me at 17, and my stepdad Keith was exactly 2 months to the day older than her. My mom has been gone for 14 years now, but I still remember this day like it was yesterday. We had left to get dinner that night, and by the time we had gotten back, Keith was passed out in the front seat of his little hatchback Mustang in the parking lot. This was the first of 2 that would find themselves wrapped around trees in my town. Keith was suffering from what would later be diagnosed as schizophrenia with bipolar tendencies, and had seemingly been self-medicating to alleviate his symptoms. Since he was asleep, my mom urged me not to wake him, as I helped her get my infant brother at the time out of the car and into our apartment. As we began to wind down for the evening, our phone began to ring, shattering the calm peace that was our lives. It was Keith's mom, Mary. She lived on the other side of the complex, which mostly housed old people and people with disabilities. She sounded panicked, screaming that something was happening in her apartment and that she needed help immediately. My mom rushed to go wake Keith up out in the parking lot, but upon running up to the car, he was nowhere to be found. She rushed back into our apartment, saying that she couldn't find Keith, when he suddenly appeared in the hallway, and neither of us had seen him come into the apartment. He seemed completely out of it and was terrified, saying that something was taking him over and that he couldn't control himself. I saw his eyes. They were black. My mother didn't have time to deal with or process his antics and gathered us to walk to his mother's apartment in the meantime. As we rushed over there as fast as we could, I remember getting a skin-crawling feeling every time Keith looked at me, like it was something completely foreign to this world, peering into my soul. We arrived and were quickly let into Mary's apartment. Her lights were flickering, and her pictures were swaying back and forth on the walls. A heavy presence could be felt by all of us. Mary was deeply religious and couldn't understand just what was taking place, but she believed it to be evil. Keith was now standing in the living room and began to sway back and forth as the activity seemed to intensify. As my mother approached him to ask what he was doing, he began to laugh. This was the deepest, most maniacal laugh I have ever heard, and I still get chills thinking about it. This voice was not his own. My mother quickly backed up, unsure of what to do, and he then began to point at me, saying, "I'm going to sacrifice that child tonight." His eyes were now blood red. Mary, by this time, had grabbed some of her belongings from her room and happened to have some blessed oil along with her Bible. She threw the oil on Keith's face, and it began to boil. The sound of sizzling and screaming was horrific. My mother's love for Keith quickly overpowered her fear, and she pulled him into the bathroom to examine his face. She was freaking out, to say the least, partially because of how unbelievable the circumstances were and just how badly he was burnt on his face. His eyes at this point were rolled into the back of his head. Then suddenly, without warning, he rushed my mom and pinned her against the wall. His younger sister Nikki and his mother quickly rushed in to help free her, with Mary dumping more oil on him. Each time, his skin literally sizzled where it landed. This fortunately worked. Keith now lay catatonic on the bathroom floor, so altogether, us girls moved him into a nearby bedroom and restrained him to the bed using anything we could find, for our own safety. Shortly after we did this, his mother called the nearby oratory and asked for a priest to assist us immediately. Nikki, who was a teenager at the time, was trying to comfort me, telling me that Keith was just really sick and not to be scared. She encouraged me to try and get some sleep, and I, of course, couldn't and wouldn't. I didn't dare close my eyes for fear of that thing hurting my mom. In this room with Keith was a picture of Jesus kneeling on top of a mountain. I heard Keith laughing in that otherworldly voice. He called out to me. He said, "You know, little girl, I used to be an angel with the most beautiful wings, until that bastard was born. Then I was cast from atop that mountain and banished." I asked, "Who are you? The devil?" He perked up, looked me dead in my eyes, and said, "I am Lucifer, the light bringer, here in the flesh. I'm not only taking Keith with me, but all of you as well. Now, untie me." I ran hysterically to my mother, who was having a cigarette to calm her nerves. She ran into the room to comfort him. When he said, "Do you want to see proof?" and against her will, my mother then extinguished the cigarette into his arm, with Keith exclaiming, "It feels so good. You'll have to adjust to the searing flames, but in due time, you too will call it home." She then rushed out of the room and closed the door. We waited with bated breath for the priest to arrive, when shortly after 3 a.m., there was a knock on the door. Thank God, it was him. For the next several hours, they attempted to cast this thing out of Keith. Probably for the best, they kept me in the living room, away from the demonic terror that was inhabiting his body. But my God, the smells that wafted throughout the complex, like putrid meat and sulfur. I soon also heard moaning and growling from dogs that didn't exist. There was a strange fog that had enveloped the apartment itself, and a strange flickering light that now emanated from the room where the exorcism was taking place. I began to close my eyes and pray to God harder than I had ever prayed before, wanting and wishing for all of it to end. When suddenly, it did. Keith had seemingly been freed of these spiritual shackles, and although I was terrified, I was more than wanting to finally get some sleep. So after the priest departed and all seemed fine, we slowly made our way back home through the damp, misty morning that was now upon us. Upon arriving home and heading inside, we all began to make our way to our bedrooms to try and sleep. I found myself in my bed, comfy, and finally about to rest, when I felt my bed shake. I quickly opened my eyes to find my bed off the floor, and my bedpost balls screwed off, each one in the corner of each post, floating there. I screamed harder than I've ever screamed before, alerting my mother, who rushed to save me. Upon her running in, my bed suddenly slammed to the ground, and my bedpost balls all fell to the floor. The events of that night and the following morning can never be forgotten by me and my family. For the next year and a half, we dealt with similar smells wafting throughout our apartment, unseen snarls and growls, and a feeling of anxiety, as if our every move was being watched. But thank God, it all eventually faded. I had since asked Keith how he came to be in that state, but I could never really get a clear answer. He often drank moonshine and was in a bad state mentally and spiritually at the time. Perhaps this weakened him enough to let something in, somehow. I've since moved on from that place, but heard something very interesting that I'd also like to share in regards to it. This was the apartment we lived in, and a young boy mysteriously passed away within it not too long ago. The details of the case are hard to find, but I believe he was about as old as I was when everything had taken place to us. There has also been multiple shootings, stabbings, and murders that have taken place near and in the complex itself. It seems like whatever possessed Keith and stalked us maybe never truly left. I'm glad to share my story with all of you, and I just want you to know that these things are very real. The paranormal is real. And please, do not meddle with it, because you just don't know what you could be inviting in. This energy, this evil, wanted my soul, and it seems like it may have taken multiple lives in pursuit of whatever nefarious things it wanted. Leia. I would like to thank Leia for submitting this chilling story of an exorcism that took place to her stepfather when she was a child. The entire situation must have been terrifying to endure, to say the least, and I commend her for being willing to share this with us and warn others that these things are very real indeed. I also believe it's important to bring awareness to these kinds of topics for a number of reasons. I am curious just how Keith became possessed, however, and if it was truly by Lucifer himself or something pretending to be him. All around, a terrifying tale from Leia. Upon laying her head down to sleep, a young woman is seemingly transported to another time or place where she interacts with malevolent spirits. This one may just make you wonder if the very same has ever happened to you. One hot Saturday morning in 2001, my ex-husband Dean and I went to the grocery store. By the time we returned home and put everything away, it was almost noon. I prepared some lunch for us, and by 2 p.m., I announced that the heat had made me feel so very tired and that I would need to lie down. Dean would go on to watch TV with the volume on low, and I closed the bedroom door. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I went out like a light. Then in what seemed like only 5 minutes later, I was woken up by a lady speaking beside my bed. It was as if she was addressing another person, but yet in a crystal clear voice across the room. She said something along the lines of, "Don't disturb her, let her sleep." This startled me. I immediately sat up in my bed and I looked around, but saw nothing. I knew I wasn't dreaming, as the voice was real, and yet spoke at an audible enough level even to wake me up. Regardless, whether a dream or real, I was too exhausted and quickly fell asleep again. Now this is where things took a stranger turn. I felt my soul leave my body. It rose up to where the wall met the ceiling. I crossed through the wall and into another place in time. I was no longer within my home, but found myself in a scene from the 18th century. It was similar to watching a black and white film, but in varying shades of gray. I saw a few people who were extravagantly dressed and wore coiffed and powdered wigs, sitting on a plush divan and some armchairs. They sat almost motionless by a small low-lying table. Only the woman slowly looked about, but nobody seemed to notice me. I looked to my left and saw a couple standing still, arms held in an arch above in the air, hands touching, poised, as if waiting for music to start for their dance. I looked past them and saw a few men, one at each small table just sitting quietly and motionless. Then I looked to my right, past the few people I initially saw, and looked in awe at the sight before me. I realized I was in a vast hall as far as the eye could see. I saw no other people, and the next thing I knew, I was back in my body, seemingly asleep, yet aware of my surroundings. I was made aware of the large crowd of people outside of my bedroom door. The sound was similar to what you would hear in a crowded bar, many people talking amongst themselves. However, there was one woman's voice that could be heard slightly above the rest of the crowd. I didn't pay it any special attention, as I wasn't focusing on anyone in particular, nor catch what she had said. And what was only a moment later, that same voice was louder and closer this time, just on the other side of my bedroom door. Although I paid a little more attention now, what she said was still indiscernible, and the voice was yet to be one that I recognized, a voice belonging to a stranger. In what seemed just another moment again, she opened the door, stepped into my room, and then shut the door behind her. I laid frozen in my bed, unable to move. Yet, I felt real terror at this point. Although I couldn't move at all, my eyes were fixed atop of the wall. Somehow, with my mind's eye, I saw her. It was my mother, who had passed away 21 years earlier. She wore a long white shroud, which I never got to see her in, but I knew that she had been buried in one. By now, I was totally terrified. I wanted to scream out for help. Better still, to get out of there. But I wasn't able to move a muscle. I watched my mother pace to and fro, past the foot of my bed, in absolute rage. She was so angry with me. She was literally spitting mad while she was scolding me. Never had I seen her this angry. The one thing I did notice, once my mother's spirit had entered the room, was that while my eyes were fixed near the ceiling, it was within my range of sight that I'd seen a soft, white, gaseous ball of light appear to my right at the corner of the ceiling. It was about the size of a basketball, though not quite as spherical. It was so very slow moving, like a swirl of white smoke within itself. Somehow I felt like it was protecting me from this evil, like a guardian angel. Once my mother was done raging at me, she faced the door and held the door slightly open. She paused and told me that I'd be dead by midnight tonight. She then shut the door behind her and left. As soon as she was out the door, the ball of light had dissipated too, and I felt instant relief. I looked at the clock, and it was now 3 p.m. All of this strangeness took place in the space of one terrifying hour. I still don't know if that was the spirit of my mother or something evil imitating her. All I know is that I jumped out of bed and rushed to the lounge room, telling Dean what I had seen, though I didn't mention my mother's parting words. Dean wasn't remotely interested. He only mumbled as I interrupted him watching his program. Well, that was the end of the nap I wasn't quite able to get. As evening approached, I constantly glanced at my watch. Although we retired for the day at about 10 p.m., that night I was fearful, yet resigned to my fate. I hadn't told a soul about my mother's message, in case it tempted fate. On waking the next morning, I couldn't have felt more relieved and thrilled to still be alive. Now that it felt safe to do so, I told Dean and later my neighbor about it all. They showed me the goosebumps on their arms and expressed fear as I recounted my experience. This was 22 years ago, and I still think of that day and the sheer terror that it brought me. It's a day that I can never forget. Johanna. That story was chilling, Johanna. I too am curious if it was some kind of spirit impersonating your mother, or if it was somehow her. The detail of what she was wearing also happened to be what she was buried in. Literally gave me goosebumps. So thank you so much for sharing your story and continuing to bring awareness to these topics. A young man seemingly interacts with his grandmother, who has long since passed away, but he isn't the only one that sees and feels her presence. This was in reference to watching one of my videos. Watching this video reminded me of something that's been going on in my house. My wife's grandmother died before we got together, and her son was the last person in the hospital room with her when she passed. Now, my work schedule varies, but generally, I'm up between 3 and 4 a.m. every day. Sometimes, I feel a presence, or I thought I saw what was a shadow in my peripheral vision. I finally told my wife about this a while back, and she proceeded to tell me that her autistic son regularly speaks to his deceased grandmother. We've both spoken to him multiple times, and apparently she visits him constantly. My wife admitted that she's seen her in our house a couple of times as well. I've offered to have the house cleansed, but my wife said no. Apparently his grandmother visits him all the time and watches over him, and he's admitted that he still sees her. He's autistic, so he's very honest with everything. I'd like your guys' input about this. Thank you, Caveman. Well, Caveman, especially since he's autistic, that really does convince me of his sincerity and honesty. The young man clearly doesn't have a motivation to gain anything by saying this. And when you have felt this presence, is it as she was in life? Is it more of a benevolent energy, or something else? It's also very interesting that your wife has seen her on multiple occasions as well. Perhaps she is watching over her grandson. Children often have an extra sense, it seems like, to be able to interact with the spirit world. Reading your story reminded me of when my brother was younger, and we had a very similar situation. My mom's father, Paul, had passed away in their family home in 2002 when my brother was just 2 years old. Prior to his passing, Paul seemed to be motioning for things to go away, things that we couldn't see, perhaps trying to state that he wasn't ready to go yet. Several months after his passing, with my grandmother Agnes still inhabiting the very same house, my brother Caden had started to interact with something that we couldn't see. He would often play around the living room, which was the same room my grandfather passed away in. One day, when he was in a full conversation with this person, my mother asked him who he was talking to, and he said, Grandpa Paul. It took the very breath out of her lungs. These interactions were fairly frequent until he was about 4 or 5 years old. Then they suddenly went away one day. It truly makes one beg the question, just how often do our loved ones truly watch over us? Thanks for sharing this one, Caveman. Thank you all for watching. If you'd like to hear more content like this, and if you enjoyed the video, please help me out in the algorithm by hitting the like button, leaving a comment, and subscribing with notifications if you're new here. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I think it's very important to bring awareness to the paranormal question. It in a sense is the ultimate question in my opinion. What truly happens when we pass through the veil of this reality and into the afterlife? I appreciate all of you as always. I hope all of you are doing well mentally, physically, and spiritually. And I hope your year is heading in a vibrant and positive direction. And I wish you all nothing but the best. Until next time, this has been Cody here at Mystery Archives. Stay safe out there, and take care.